She had $40,000 in cash, confidential documents that could destroy 3 careers, and a company bleeding out from the inside. And she left all of it on a cafe table because her hands were shaking too hard to think straight. What happened next wasn't a miracle. It wasn't fate. It was a quiet man in a worn flannel jacket who could have walked away and changed his entire life, but didn't. This is a story about what people do when nobody's watching. If you stay until the end, I promise you won't forget it. Hit like, leave a comment with your city. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning Victoria Hale lost everything started like every other morning she'd had in the past 8 months, badly. Her alarm went off at 5:47 a.m., 13 minutes before it was supposed to, because she'd set a second one the night before and then forgotten about it. She lay in the dark of her downtown Portland apartment, staring at the ceiling for exactly 4 seconds before her phone lit up with a text from her assistant, Donna, that read, "Marcus called again. Says it's urgent. I think he means it this time." Victoria closed her eyes. Marcus Elroy was the lead investor for Hale Dynamics, the company her father had spent 23 years building from a small biotech startup into a regional healthcare solutions firm with contracts across 6 New England states. Her father had handed it to her 18 months ago, right before the cancer took him. He'd handed it to her and Leonard Graves, his oldest friend and the company's CFO, with the understanding that the two of them would carry it forward together. Her father had trusted Leonard completely. Victoria was starting to wonder why. She got dressed in the dark, skipped coffee at the apartment because the machine had broken 2 days ago, and she hadn't had time to deal with it, and drove through wet October streets to a cafe on Maple Street called Brennan's, which opened at 6 and made the only Americano in Portland she actually liked. The city was gray and damp. Leaves came off the elms in slow spirals, catching in windshield wipers and clogging gutters. Victoria parked half a block up, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. She was 30 years old, and she was exhausted in a way that sleep didn't fix anymore. Inside Brennan's, the warmth hit her first. Coffee and something baking, the low murmur of a few early regulars. She ordered her Americano, took the corner booth near the window, and pulled out her laptop and the leather clutch she'd been carrying since the night before. The clutch was Italian, dark cognac, a birthday gift from a board member she'd never particularly liked. Inside it, her reading glasses, a USB drive with the Q3 internal audit, 2 folded contracts she needed to review before the morning meeting, and $40,000 in banded cash. The cash was for an off-books payment to a private financial investigator named Greer, who didn't take wire transfers or credit cards, and who had, 2 weeks ago, handed Victoria a preliminary report suggesting that approximately $3.2 million had moved through Hale Dynamics accounts in ways that didn't match any legitimate vendor relationship she could identify. She hadn't told Leonard about the investigator. She hadn't told anyone. The Americano arrived. She opened her laptop, started reading through a spreadsheet Donna had forwarded the night before, and for about 12 minutes, the morning was almost manageable. Then her phone rang. The screen said, "Marcus Elroy, mobile." She answered, "Victoria." His voice was flat, clipped. Marcus was 61, a former investment banker who wore good suits and said things like "frankly," and at the end of the day, as often as punctuation. She'd always found him tolerable in the way you find a recurring toothache tolerable, familiar enough to manage. "We need to talk about the Q3 numbers." "I know, I was going to call you after the... I've already spoken with Leonard." She stopped. "He called me last night," Marcus continued. "He's concerned. He thinks there may be a leadership issue." The word leadership sat in her chest like a cold stone. "Marcus, I'm not saying I agree with him. I'm saying this conversation needs to happen in person, and it needs to happen soon. The board is asking questions I can't answer with the information I currently have, and frankly, Victoria, the position I'm being put in, what did Leonard tell you?" A pause. "He said the Q3 shortfall is more significant than what was reported to investors. He said there's been some internal mismanagement of... He said I mismanaged it." Another pause, longer. "He didn't use those words, but that's what he meant." Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Outside the cafe window, a delivery truck reversed slowly through the alley, beeping. "Marcus, I need you to listen to me. What Leonard told you is not the complete picture. There are things I've been looking into, financial irregularities that go back further than Q3, and I am very close to having documentation that..." "Victoria." His tone shifted. "Careful now." Almost gentle, which was worse. "I've known Leonard for 22 years. I knew your father. I understand this is a difficult time, and I want to give you every benefit of the doubt, but if there are serious financial problems inside that company, the board has a fiduciary responsibility to, I know what the board's responsibility is, to consider all options, including structural changes. She understood what structural changes meant. Give me 2 weeks, she said. I can give you one. The call ended. Victoria sat very still in the corner booth at Brennan's Cafe on Maple Street with her cold Americano and her open laptop and the leather clutch sitting on the seat beside her. Her chest felt tight. Her hands, when she looked down at them, were trembling faintly. Not dramatically, not the way people tremble in movies, just a small persistent vibration she couldn't make stop. She thought about her father, about the way he used to sit across from Leonard at dinner and laugh at his jokes with complete, unguarded ease. He's the one person in this business I'd trust with my life, he told her once. Don't ever forget that, Vicky. She pulled some cash out of the tip, left it on the table, gathered her laptop, and walked out. She did not take the clutch. She was 4 blocks away before she realized. It hit her mid-stride, the way forgetting something catastrophic always does. A sudden hollow drop in the stomach, the brain scrambling backward through the last 20 minutes. She stopped on the sidewalk. A woman with a stroller clipped her shoulder without apologizing. The clutch, the table, the $40,000. She spun and started walking fast, then faster, weaving through the morning foot traffic, her laptop tucked under one arm. A one-way street forced her to backtrack half a block. She could feel her pulse in her temples. If someone had taken it, if the cash was gone, she couldn't explain the money to anyone. Not without admitting she'd hired Greer. Not without explaining why she'd needed someone outside the company to look at those numbers. The documentation on the USB drive alone, in the wrong hands, could torpedo the investigation before it started. Leonard would know immediately what she'd been doing. She pushed through Brennan's front door. The corner booth was empty. The clutch was gone. Victoria stood in the middle of the cafe, scanning the room. The barista, a young woman named Amy who'd served her at least 100 times, looked up from the espresso machine with a slightly startled expression. The booth. Did someone? Victoria started. A guy picked it up, Amy said. Just walked up to the counter and asked if it belonged to the woman who just left. I said I thought so. He went after you. Victoria turned. Through the cafe window, she could see the sidewalk, and on it, about 30 feet away, a man in a dark flannel jacket was standing still in the middle of the pedestrian traffic, looking in her direction. I was tall, early 30s, with dark hair pushed back from a face that was unremarkable at first glance. Not handsome in any polished way, just angular and calm, with the kind of stillness that people either have from years of practice or don't have at all. His jacket was worn at the elbows. His work boots were the kind that had seen actual work. He was holding her leather clutch in one hand as naturally as a man holds something that belongs to someone else. Their eyes met through the glass. Victoria pushed back through the door. Sam, is this yours? His voice was even, direct. No performance in it. No expectation of reward or recognition. Just a simple question asked the way you'd ask someone if they dropped their keys. Yes. She reached for it. Thank you. Everything should still be in there. He handed it over without hesitation. I didn't open it, just picked it up off the table when I saw you leave. She checked. The cash was there. The USB drive was there. Both contracts, folded exactly as she'd left them. I need to... She stopped, steadied herself. How much can I give you? I want to... Nothing, he said it simply, without awkwardness. She blinked. I'm sorry? You don't owe me anything. He glanced over her shoulder briefly. The kind of habitual situational awareness she noticed because it wasn't anxiety. It was something else. Then brought his eyes back to her. I hope your morning gets better. He turned and walked away. Not hurriedly. Not coldly. Just walked away, hands going into the pockets of his worn jacket, moving through the leaf-wet Portland sidewalk, like a man with somewhere modest to be. Victoria stood there holding $40,000 and watched him go. She spent most of that morning in a conference room on the 14th floor of Hale Dynamics' Portland office, sitting across from Leonard Graves and 2 board members she'd known since she was a teenager, listening to a carefully constructed version of reality in which she was the problem. Leonard was 67, silver-haired, and possessed of a particular kind of grandfatherly authority that had always made disagreeing with him feel vaguely wrong, like arguing with a history teacher. He had a habit of touching his chin when he spoke, a gesture she used to find thoughtful. Now it felt like a tell. The Q3 shortfall is a reflection of decisions made in the second half of the fiscal year, he said, his voice even, measured. I want to be clear that I'm not assigning blame here. I'm simply identifying patterns. Patterns. She wrote the word down on her notepad and drew a small box around it. The consulting contracts, Victoria said. The ones from March and April. Can you walk me through those again? Something moved behind Leonard's eyes. Fast, controlled, like a door closing. Those were vendor relationships I've managed for years. Your father approved the framework for those contracts, and my father died in January. Those contracts were approved in March. Silence. One of the board members, Gerald Fitch, red-faced, always slightly damp-looking, shifted in his chair. Victoria, I don't think this is the venue to... I'm just asking about the contracts, Gerald. What I think Victoria is struggling with, Leonard said, and the gentleness in his voice made something in her stomach turn cold, is the transition, which is completely understandable, losing her father the way she did, and then immediately taking on the responsibilities of, don't. She said it quietly. Don't do that. Leonard looked at her with patient, sorrowful eyes. I think we all need a day or two to... I'll have a full accounting of every consulting disbursement on your desk by end of week, Victoria said, gathering her notepad. Both of you. She looked at Gerald, then at the other board member, a woman named Patricia Howe, who had said almost nothing all morning and was now studying the grain of the conference table with focused intensity. If the numbers are clean, then we have nothing to talk about. If they're not, we have a very different conversation. She stood. Leonard looked up at her. Victoria. Leonard. Your father, he said softly, would want us to handle this with discretion. She looked at him for a long moment. My father would want to know the truth. She walked out. In the elevator going down, she pressed herself into the corner and closed her eyes and breathed slowly. The meeting had gone exactly as badly as she'd expected. What she hadn't expected was how alone she would feel afterward. Not surprised alone, but deeply, structurally alone, the kind that settles in your bones. She had Donna, who was loyal and efficient and genuinely kind. She had Greer, the financial investigator, who was professional and thorough and completely transactional. She had Marcus Elroy, who'd known her father and was now accepting briefings from the man who might have been stealing from his company. What she didn't have was a single person she could call right now and say, I think I'm in real trouble and I don't know who to trust. She stood on the corner outside the building in the gray October air and thought, with complete illogical clarity, about the man in the flannel jacket. Not because he was remarkable, because he wasn't. He'd picked up a leather clutch containing $40,000 in cash and walked 4 blocks through a crowded city morning to hand it back to a stranger, asked for nothing, and then walked away. In the world. Victoria had been living in for the past 18 months. That was the most unusual thing she'd seen. It took her 3 days to find him. She felt slightly ridiculous about this, which she managed by telling herself it was simply a loose end she needed to close. She hadn't properly thanked him. The gesture deserved acknowledgement. It was the professional thing to do. She did not examine this reasoning too closely. The cafe helped. Amy the barista remembered him, comes in maybe twice a week, usually early, gets black coffee, tips well, always looks tired. And while she didn't know his name, she'd seen him park a dark blue pickup truck on the side street. 2 days of looking at vehicles on that block and a partial plate number she'd caught through the window led her to Donna, who had a cousin who worked in city administration and who owed her a favor, and who found the registration without asking too many questions. Ethan Cole, 32 years old, address 14 Birchwood Lane, on the eastern edge of Portland, near the water. She almost didn't go. She drove by once, slowly. It was a modest house, not run down exactly, but the kind of place that was surviving rather than thriving. White vinyl siding with a patch of darker replacement panels near the foundation. A detached garage with the door propped open showing a workbench and organized tools. A front yard with a maple tree that had dropped most of its leaves in a yellow ring around its base. And on the porch, a little girl, maybe 7 years old, sitting cross-legged on a wooden bench with a thick book open in her lap and a stuffed rabbit wedged under one arm. She was wearing a purple fleece jacket over what looked like pajama pants, and she was reading with the focused solemnity of a child who has discovered that books are preferable to most other things. Victoria parked and sat there for a moment. She noticed the fence along the property line. The left section had separated from a post and was leaning at an angle that would get worse once winter hit. And in the side yard, Ethan Cole was crouched over that post with a cordless drill, working on the repair alone, his back to the street. She got out of the car. The little girl looked up from her book immediately. Sharp eyes, brown, watchful. She didn't say anything, just watched Victoria walk up the front path with the careful attention of a child who has learned to pay attention to strangers. "Hi," Victoria said. "Hi," the girl said. Not unfriendly, just careful. "Is your dad home?" "He's fixing the fence." "I can see that. I'm not going to bother him. She paused. "What are you reading?" The girl tilted the cover up without changing expression. "The Phantom Toll Booth." "Good book," Victoria said, and meant it. Something shifted slightly in the girl's face. Not quite a smile, but the precondition for one. "Do you know it?" "I read it when I was around your age. There's a part with a watchdog that—" "Talk," the girl said, with the authority of someone who has already encountered talk and formed an opinion. "He's my favorite." "Mine too," a sound from the side yard. Then Ethan Cole came around the corner of the house holding the cordless drill, and when he saw Victoria standing on his front walk, he stopped walking. His face went briefly through something, surprise, calculation, then a careful settling into neutral. "Mr. Cole," Victoria said. He looked at her for a moment. "You tracked me down." "I did." She didn't apologize for it. "I wanted to properly thank you. The other morning, what you did, you could have just kept walking. I'm not going to apologize for handing back something that didn't belong to me. I was harder to read out here than he'd been on the sidewalk. On the sidewalk, he'd just been a stranger doing a decent thing. Here, on his own property, with his daughter on the porch, and his drill in his hand and the honest tiredness in his face, he was something more specific and somehow more guarded. "I know," Victoria said. "I'm not asking you to. I wanted to. There's some cash. I brought an envelope. I don't want your money." "Mr. Cole." Ethan. She held the envelope out. $500. "It's not. I know it's not proportional. He looked at the envelope. He looked at her. Something passed through his expression that she couldn't name. Not offense, not pride exactly. Just a kind of weariness with the conversation. "Keep it," he said. "Why?" The question came out before she'd decided to ask it, and it surprised them both. He shifted his weight, glanced at Sophie on the porch, who was very pointedly reading her book, and very clearly listening to every word. Then he looked back at Victoria. "Because I didn't do it for money," he said. "I did it because it was the right thing. And if I take the money, that changes what it was." He paused. "Does that make sense to you?" Victoria stood on the front path of 14 Birchwood Lane with $500 in an envelope and looked at a man who had turned down easy money twice and talked about the integrity of an action, like it was something a person could accidentally corrupt. "Not entirely," she said honestly. Something in his face shifted, barely, just a fraction, and she realized it might have been the beginning of a smile. "Fair enough," he said. "I appreciate you coming by." He moved past her toward the garage. "The fence post," she said, stopping him. "It's not just leaning. The bracket's separated from the concrete footing. If you're setting it in place again without repouring, it'll just go back down." He turned and looked at her. "I grew up in a house with a fence like that," she said. "My father fixed it 4 times before he finally admitted the footing had cracked." Ethan looked at the post, then back at her. "You know how to repour a footing?" "No. But I know a man who does." He considered her for a moment, measured, not suspicious, just thinking. "Sophie," he called, without taking his eyes off Victoria. "What?" Sophie called back, still looking at her book. "You want hot chocolate?" A pause. "Yes." "Then put the book down and come help me in the kitchen." He looked at Victoria. "You want coffee? It's not great, but it's hot." She should have said no. She had a meeting at 2, a call with Greer at 4, and a 12-page contract review sitting on her passenger seat. "Sure," she said. "Yeah." The kitchen was the most honest room Victoria had been in for a long time. It wasn't dirty, but it was lived in the way that only a house without a second adult gets lived in. A crayon drawing held to the refrigerator by 3 different magnets, a small stack of library books on the counter, a coffee mug with a chip in the rim that had been there long enough that neither occupant noticed it anymore. A child's raincoat hung over a chair back. A grocery list was stuck to the cabinet with a piece of masking tape, written in Ethan's blocky handwriting: milk, bread, bananas, Sophie's shampoo, not the orange kind. Sophie made her own hot chocolate with the concentrated focus of someone who has been entrusted with a privilege and intends to honor it. Ethan made coffee with a drip machine that had a crack in the carafe handle, held together with electrical tape. He handed Victoria a mug. She took it without looking at the crack. "You work in the city?" he asked. Not small talk, just orienting himself. I run a company. Healthcare Solutions, technology and staffing contracts for regional hospitals and clinics. He nodded slowly. Stressful. It has its moments. She wrapped her hands around the mug. What about you? You do repair work? When there's work. He sat down across from her, elbows on the table. Some carpentry, some electrical, odd jobs. He said it simply, without bitterness or apology. Sophie climbed into the chair beside him with her hot chocolate and her stuffed rabbit, and opened her book again on the table. Sophie, Ethan said. I'm listening, she said. You're reading. I can do both. He gave her a look. She put a finger between the pages as a bookmark, closed it, and looked at Victoria with her disconcertingly direct brown eyes. What company? She asked. Sophie. It's okay, Victoria said. Hale Dynamics, my father started it. And now you run it? I do. Is it hard? Sophie. Ethan's voice was patient but firm. It's a reasonable question, Sophie said, which was, Victoria noted, an extremely precise observation for a 7-year-old. Yes, Victoria told her. It's very hard right now. Sophie considered this. My dad says hard things are worth doing if they matter to someone other than you. Victoria looked at Ethan. He was looking at his coffee. He's right, Victoria said quietly. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied, and reopened her book. They sat in the kitchen for 40 minutes. Victoria drank 2 cups of the cracked carafe coffee and talked to Ethan about the fence repair and the Portland winter and the library program Sophie attended on Wednesdays. And the conversation was completely unremarkable and completely unlike anything Victoria had experienced in the past 18 months. It was just ordinary. Present tense and ordinary without agenda. When she left, she realized she'd forgotten, for 40 minutes, to be afraid. The fear came back on the drive home, slowly, the way cold comes in through a window you thought you'd closed. Her phone had 12 unread messages. Donna, Greer, 2 from a number she didn't recognize, 1 from Leonard that said simply, call me when you get a chance. No rush. No rush from Leonard meant considerable rush. She pulled over on a side street and sat with the car running, the heat going, her phone in her hand. Outside, the October dark had come in fast the way it does in Maine, and the streetlights made orange halos in the mist off the water. She opened Greer's message first. Found something in the March contracts. Not consulting. This is passed through to a shell. Call me tonight. She stared at the screen. Shell company. That meant the money wasn't going to vendors. It was going somewhere else, through something designed to hide where. $3.2 million, and that was only what Greer had found in the first sweep. She called Greer. He answered on the second ring. Tell me, she said. The entity receiving the payments is registered in Delaware under the name Westbrook Analytical Partners. No website, no employees on record, no physical address beyond a registered agent service in Wilmington. The formation date is February 14th of this year. A pause. 12 days after your father died. Victoria pressed her hand flat against the dashboard. The signatory on the corporate documents, Greer said, is a man named Daniel Price. I'm still running him down, but the registered agent is the same one used by 3 other entities with ties to Leonard Graves' personal financial history. She said nothing. Victoria. Greer's voice was careful. I want you to understand what I'm telling you. This isn't sloppy bookkeeping. Someone built this structure deliberately. The timing, the registration, the payment routing, this was planned. Planned for when, she said, already knowing. Planned for when the company changed hands, he said. When there was a new person at the top who didn't know the old arrangements. She sat in the dark on a side street in Portland, Maine, listening to the heat fan in her car and the faint sound of water somewhere nearby. How much more, she asked. Beyond the 3.2? I don't know yet. I need access to the Q1 and Q2 wire logs, not just the summaries. The full transaction records. I'll get them. Victoria. Be careful who you ask. I know. She ended the call. She sat for a while longer, then she picked up her phone one more time and looked at Leonard's message. Call me when you get a chance. No rush. She put the phone in her bag. She drove home in the dark, and the whole way there she thought about a man in a worn flannel jacket who had said with complete quiet certainty, if I take the money, that changes what it was. She thought about what it must feel like to move through the world with that kind of clarity. She thought she might need to borrow some of it. Somewhere across the city, on Birchwood Lane, the kitchen light was still on. Sophie was asleep, finally, with her rabbit and her book. Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee and a manila folder of bills he'd already arranged in order of urgency, which was a way of feeling in control of something he wasn't in control of. He thought briefly about the woman in the good coat who knew about fence footings and drank bad coffee without remarking on it. Then he closed the folder, turned off the light, and went to check on his daughter. Some things you don't let yourself think about. Not yet. 3 days after her kitchen visit to Birchwood Lane, Victoria found herself doing something she hadn't done in years. Going home before 8 o'clock. It wasn't intentional. The building's HVAC system had developed a problem that maintenance couldn't fix until morning, and by 6:30 the 14th floor was cold enough that she could see her breath when she exhaled over her laptop. Donna had packed up at 5 with an apologetic look that said she'd been waiting for permission to leave for 2 hours. The cleaning crew came through, looked at Victoria still sitting at her desk in her coat, and decided to vacuum around her. At 7, she finally closed the laptop, admitted defeat, and drove home through streets that were shiny black with freezing rain. She almost missed it. She was stopped at a red light on Clement Street, 2 blocks from her building, when she saw the truck. Dark blue, familiar dent on the rear quarter panel. She'd cataloged it almost without meaning to during her slow drive past Birchwood Lane. It was parked outside a low concrete building with frosted glass windows and a sign above the door that read, Cumberland County Free Medical Clinic. Walk-ins welcome. Mon Schwed E. Fry. Tonight was Wednesday. Victoria looked at the light, still red. She looked at the clinic. She told herself she was not going to do what she was already doing, which was pulling into the parking lot across the street. She sat in her car with the engine running and the heat on and watched the frosted glass windows for a few minutes, seeing nothing except the blurred movement of shapes inside. There was no rational explanation for why she was still here. She was cold and tired, and she had a call with Greer at 8:30 that she needed to prepare for. Then the clinic door opened. Ethan came out first, holding the door. Behind him, supported partly by a wall and partly by his own stubborn refusal to admit he needed more support, was a teenager, 16, maybe 17, wearing a hoodie and a jacket that wasn't warm enough for October in Maine. His right arm was wrapped in fresh bandaging from wrist to mid-forearm. His face was the particular gray-white of someone who had recently been through something painful and was now on the other side of it, still shaky, trying to look fine. Ethan said something to him. The kid shook his head. Ethan said something else, and this time waited, and the teenager looked down at his shoes for a long moment before he nodded. Ethan went back inside. 2 minutes later, he returned with a brown paper bag, the kind pharmacies use, and handed it to the kid, along with what looked like a folded piece of paper. He tapped the paper once with his finger and said something Victoria couldn't hear through 2 layers of glass and 40 feet of freezing rain. The kid took it, looked at Ethan, said something that made Ethan put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Not a hug, not a dramatic gesture, just a hand on the shoulder, firm and brief, the way you touch someone when you want them to know they're not invisible. Then the teenager walked away, pulling his jacket tighter, and Ethan stood under the overhang of the clinic door and watched him go until he turned the corner. Victoria sat very still in her car. She had watched enough people in enough professional contexts to understand the difference between someone performing competence and someone operating from it. What she'd just seen was not a kind civilian helping out at a free clinic. The way Ethan had dressed the arm, the way he'd moved around the kid's pain without flinching, the specific authority in how he'd handled the interaction, that was medical training, not a first aid course. Something much deeper and longer and harder earned than that. She thought about his hands when he'd handed her back the clutch on the sidewalk. She'd registered them as rough workers' hands. But they'd also been very still. Surgeons had still hands. She drove home through the freezing rain with a feeling she couldn't quite name. Something between curiosity and the quiet unease of realizing a person is more complicated than you thought. She looked him up that night. It took longer than she expected, partly because she was looking for the wrong version of him. She started with general searches, Ethan Cole, Portland, Maine, and got nothing useful. Then she tried the clinic, pulled the volunteer roster from an old press release on their website, and found his name listed simply as E. Cole, MD, Volunteer Medical Staff. MD. She stared at that period after the D for a long moment. Then she pulled up the Maine Medical Board's license registry. Ethan James Cole, licensed physician, specialty, trauma surgery and emergency medicine. License status, inactive. Voluntary suspension, March 2022. March 2022. 3 years ago. She pulled up his publication history next. Academic papers were public record, and someone who'd made it to trauma surgery had almost certainly published. She found 7, the most recent dated 2021, in the Journal of Trauma and Acute Care Surgery. The author bio on the last one read, Dr. Ethan Cole is a board-certified trauma surgeon and former staff physician with the 75th Medical Brigade, U.S. Army. He currently holds a position at Maine Medical Center's Level 1D Trauma Unit. Former staff physician, U.S. Army, trauma surgeon. She sat with this for a while. She searched for more and found less than she expected. No scandal, no misconduct, no dramatic public unraveling. Just a man who had been, by every available account, very good at a difficult and important job, and who had then, quietly, stopped. The license suspension was voluntary, which meant he'd done it himself. There was no disciplinary record attached to it. She found the obituary almost by accident in the Portland Press-Herald archives. Claire Marie Cole, 29, passed away on February 18, 2022, after a 14-month illness. She is survived by her husband, Ethan, and her daughter, Sophie, age 4. February 2022. The license suspension followed 5 weeks later. Victoria closed her laptop and sat in her dark apartment with the freezing rain against the windows and thought about a man who had spent years learning how to keep people alive and then watched the one person he most needed to save die anyway. She thought about what that does to a person. Not the grief. She understood grief. She'd buried her father 8 months ago. But the specific cruelty of being a trauma surgeon and losing your wife to cancer. The way your training becomes a kind of accusation. The way every tool in your hands that wasn't enough becomes something you have to look at every day. She understood now why he'd walked away from it. She wasn't sure she agreed with it, but she understood it. What she didn't understand, what kept her sitting in the dark longer than she should have, was why a man like that was fixing fences and doing odd jobs when he had skills most people spent a decade trying to acquire. Why he was dressing a teenager's arm in a free clinic on a Wednesday night instead of saving lives in an operating room. The obvious answer was grief. People do stranger things, but there was something else in it that she couldn't quite locate yet. Something in the deliberate smallness of the life he'd chosen, the way he seemed to be living inside a perimeter he'd drawn around himself and Sophie. And she had a feeling that understanding it would require knowing him better than one cup of bad coffee allowed. She was aware that this line of reasoning had nothing to do with the $40,000 or the leather clutch or even basic gratitude. She went to bed with that awareness, sitting uncomfortably in her chest, and slept badly. The next time she had a reason to go to Birchwood Lane, she manufactured one. She told herself it wasn't manufacturing. Sophie had mentioned the Wednesday library program, and Victoria had, through Donna, confirmed that the Portland Public Library's children's branch was running a reading series for that age group, and she happened to have a copy of A Wrinkle in Time that she'd finished rereading last month and that Sophie would probably... She was manufacturing a reason. She knew this. She went anyway. Ethan answered the door in a gray t-shirt with a paint smear on the sleeve and an expression that moved through mild surprise and landed on something carefully neutral. He looked at the book in her hand. "Sophie," he called over his shoulder, from somewhere in the back of the house. "What?" "You've got company." A pause, the sound of small feet, and then Sophie appeared around the corner in the same purple fleece jacket, now with a cereal bowl in one hand, studying Victoria with her disconcertingly adult brown eyes. "You brought a book," she said. "A Wrinkle in Time," Victoria said. "Have you read it?" "No." Sophie looked at her father. "Can I have it?" "Say thank you first." "Thank you." She took the book, examined the cover with the focused assessment of someone evaluating an investment, and then looked back up. "Do you want to come in?" "That's up to your father." Ethan stepped back from the door. The kitchen was the same as before. The chipped mug, the crayon drawings on the fridge, the grocery list in masking tape. Except today there was something new. A thick manila folder on the table with pages spread out around it, and a second folder closed beside it with a handwritten label she caught only a glimpse of before Ethan gathered the papers together in an unhurried but deliberate way. She didn't try to read them. "Coffee?" he said. "I'm not going to keep saying no and pretending I don't want it." Something moved in his face. Not quite a smile. He poured 2 cups. Sophie installed herself at the table with her cereal bowl and opened A Wrinkle in Time to the first page with the reverence she apparently extended to all books. Ethan sat across from Victoria and wrapped his hands around his mug and looked at her with the same measured directness he'd had on the sidewalk that first morning. "How's the company?" he said. "Complicated." "Still the same complicated or new complicated?" She looked at him. "What makes you think it's gotten more complicated? You look like you haven't slept in 3 days." "That's..." Observant of you. Sophie looks like that after a hard week at school. You look the same way, scaled up. She didn't know whether to be annoyed or amused, so she drank her coffee and said, "There's someone inside the company who's been taking money. I can't prove it yet, not completely, and until I can, I'm in a position where I'm watching it happen and I can't stop it without tipping off the person doing it." She hadn't planned to say that. It came out in the easy, unguarded way things come out when you're in a kitchen that has no agenda. Ethan said nothing for a moment. He wasn't uncomfortable with silence, she'd noticed. He used it the way some people use words, as a form of active listening. "How much?" he asked finally. "Probably more than 3 million. My investigator is still counting." "And this person? They know you're looking?" "I don't think so. Not yet." "But you think they might figure it out?" "Yes." He turned his mug in a slow half circle. "Then you need to move faster than they do." "I know that. And you need someone you trust with the information while you're moving." She held his gaze. "I don't have many of those." He looked back at her steadily. Whatever he was reading in her face, he read it carefully. "You have Donna," he said. She blinked. "I've mentioned Donna once." "You mentioned her twice. You trust her." "She's my assistant." "That's not what I said." Victoria put her mug down. Sophie had turned 2 pages of her book and was eating cereal without looking at it, fully absorbed. Outside, the October wind picked up and pushed a scatter of leaves against the kitchen window. "You're very perceptive," Victoria said, "for a handyman." It landed between them, not cruel, but pointed, and she knew, even as she said it, that it was a test, a small, unfair one. Ethan looked at her. His expression didn't change much, but something shifted in his eyes. A brief, quiet recalibration, like a person deciding how much of themselves to show. "Probably," he said simply. Not defensive, not wounded, just probably. She looked at him for a long moment. "I saw you," she said, "on Wednesday night, outside the clinic on Clement Street." Silence. Sophie turned another page. "I wasn't following you," Victoria said. "I was stopped at a light. I recognized the truck." Ethan said nothing. He was looking at his mug. "The teenager," she said, you dressed his arm. You knew exactly what you were doing." A pause. When he looked up, his face was still controlled, but there was something careful in it now. Careful in the way a door is careful when it's being held almost shut. "I volunteer there," he said. "I know, I looked you up." She kept her voice even. "Dr. Ethan Cole, trauma surgery and emergency medicine, board certified, 7 published papers, former military." She paused. "Voluntary license suspension, March 2022. The kitchen was very quiet. Sophie looked up from her book. She looked at her father, then at Victoria, with the particular alertness of a child who is reading the temperature of a room. Then she quietly closed her book, climbed down from her chair, and said, "I'm going to go read in my room." Neither adult stopped her. Ethan waited until her footsteps had receded down the hallway. Then he put both hands flat on the table and looked at them. "That was February," he said. His voice was level. "The license. I know, I saw Claire's obituary." He didn't flinch, but she saw the stillness in him deepen, the kind of stillness that isn't peace. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know it's fine." He said it too quickly, then caught himself. "I mean, it's not fine, but I've made my peace with it." "Have you?" He looked at her. "Mostly." She held that. "Why did you suspend the license?" "Because I couldn't." He stopped. Started again. "Because I was in an OR 3 weeks after she died, and I was standing over a man who was bleeding out from a car accident, and I realized that my hands were doing the work, but I wasn't there. I was somewhere else. And that's not something you can afford to be in that situation." He paused. "So I stopped." "You stopped operating." "I stopped practicing. There's a difference." "You practice at the clinic. That's different." "How?" "Nobody's open on that table. I'm not responsible for—" He cut himself off. "It's different." Victoria looked at him. He was not a man who talked about himself easily. She could see it in the small resistances, the sentences that started and redirected, the way he held the subject at arm's length, even while discussing it. She thought about the teenage boy with the bandaged arm, the hand on the shoulder, the firm steadiness of someone who hadn't lost his ability to care for people, even if he'd lost the will to operate on them. "Sophia was 4, she said quietly. "Yeah, and you've been doing this alone since then." He looked at her with a directness that was almost startling. "I'm not looking for sympathy. I'm not offering sympathy, I'm just—" She searched for the word. accounting for what I see. He held her gaze for a moment. And what do you see? A person who's been very careful about what he allows himself to want. Something moved through his face. Quick, unguarded, gone before she could fully read it. That's a perceptive thing to say, he said, with the faintest edge of irony, turning her earlier word back at her without heat. For a CEO. She smiled slightly. Probably. They sat in the quiet kitchen for a moment, the wind pressing leaves against the window, the clock above the stove marking time with its small mechanical tick. It wasn't comfortable exactly. Too much had been said for comfortable, but it was honest, and Victoria had been sitting in rooms full of comfortable lies long enough to know the difference. She came back the following Saturday, and she told herself this time it was because Ethan had mentioned in passing that the fence footing repair required a second person to hold the form while he poured, and she had nothing else on her calendar before noon, which was true and also beside the point. She held the form. She got concrete on her coat sleeve. Sophie sat on the porch and offered occasional engineering commentary that was surprisingly specific for a 7-year-old. They ate lunch afterward, soup that Ethan made from scratch, because there was a chicken carcass in the refrigerator from the night before, and he was, apparently, constitutionally incapable of wasting food. He didn't make a production of the cooking, just did it the way he seemed to do most things, without commentary, while carrying on a conversation about something else. What was it like? Sophie asked at the table, not looking up from her soup. When you were in the army? Sophie, Ethan said. It's a valid question. Where'd you hear that word? From you. Ethan gave Victoria a briefly pained look over the top of Sophie's head. Victoria pressed her lips together. It was loud, he said to Sophie, and hot, and a lot of waiting around interrupted by short periods where everything happened very fast. Were you scared? Sometimes. Sophie stirred her soup. But you still went. I was younger then. Grandpa says that's not an explanation. When did you talk to Grandpa? He called on Tuesday when you were outside. Sophie looked up with the serene directness she'd apparently been born with. He says you should call him back. Ethan pinched the bridge of his nose. I'll call him back. He also said, Sophie, that you need to stop hiding in that house. She said it with the flat factual delivery of a child repeating something she's heard, not fully sure of its weight. Then she looked at her soup again. I don't think we're hiding. I like our house. Ethan was very still. So do I, he said quietly. Victoria looked at her soup bowl and said nothing. After lunch, Sophie went to her room to read, and Ethan washed the dishes with the methodical efficiency of someone who has done this exact task 10,000 times alone. Victoria dried because she reached for the towel before she thought about it, and they stood at the sink in a companionable quiet that was not quite the silence of strangers anymore. Your father calls? She said. Occasionally. And you don't call back. I call back. Back, eventually. He worries about you. Ethan handed her a bowl. He worries about Sophie. That's not what she said, he said. He was quiet for a moment. My father is a practical man. He worries about things he can affect. He can't affect much about my situation, so he circles. It's his way. Is it working? He almost smiled. Not especially. Maybe you should let it. He glanced at her sideways. It was a brief look, just a moment, but there was something in it that was more open than his usual carefully maintained neutral. Something that was either gratitude or the beginning of something more complicated, and he seemed to decide quickly that it was too soon for either. He handed her the last dish. You're good at other people's business, he said. Occupational hazard. Of being a CEO? Of being my father's daughter. She dried the dish. He used to say that understanding what motivates people is the only skill in business that actually matters. Everything else is just math. Smart man. He was. She paused. He was also wrong about a few important things, which is something I'm dealing with right now. Ethan turned off the water. He turned to look at her fully, leaning back against the counter. The first time he'd given her his complete attention in a way that wasn't guarded. How close are you, he said. With the investigation. She considered how much to say. Close enough to be dangerous, she said. Not close enough to be safe. He held her gaze. What's the difference? The difference is documentation. I need the full transaction records, not the summaries, the actual wire logs. They're on a secured server inside the company building, and the only way to access them without flagging the person I'm investigating is to do it from inside after hours, using credentials that don't belong to me. Credentials belonging to who? The company's IT director, man named Saul Park. He's clean. I'd stake everything on that. But if I ask him directly, it creates a paper trail, and Leonard has eyes in that department. Ethan was quiet for a moment. So you need to get in and get out without anyone knowing you were there, essentially. And you're telling me this because you asked. She paused. And because I don't have anyone else I can think out loud with. He looked at her for a long moment. I'm a handyman, he said. You're a handyman who spent 5 years operating in forward surgical units in environments where information security was probably a matter of survival, she said. You're a handyman who looked at a sidewalk full of people and picked out a woman walking too fast without her bag before I was 20 feet from the cafe door. She kept her voice level. You notice things. You think operationally, and you don't talk when you shouldn't. The kitchen was very quiet. I don't want Sophie anywhere near this, he said. Neither do I. And I'm not... He stopped. I left that life. I made a choice to... I know. She didn't push. She just held the space. He looked at the window. Outside, the afternoon light was going flat and gray, the way it does in Maine when November is only a few weeks away and the daylight doesn't so much end as slowly give up. Let me think about it, he said. She nodded. She put the dish towel on the counter and gathered her bag. Victoria. He said it as she reached the kitchen doorway. She turned. He was still leaning against the counter, arms folded, looking at her with that same unreadable steadiness. Whatever you think you know about me from the license record and the papers, be careful building a picture from incomplete information. You might get the shape right and the inside wrong. I know, she said. That's why I keep coming back. She left before he could respond to that. She didn't hear from him for 4 days, and she didn't reach out. She'd said what she'd said, and pushing further would have changed the nature of what was between them in a way she wasn't willing to risk. She focused on work. She had 2 more sessions with Greer, who had now identified 5 distinct shell entities connected to the Westbrook Analytical Partners structure, with a cumulative transfer total approaching $6 million. The oldest transaction they'd found was dated 3 months before her father's diagnosis. That piece of information sat in her chest like broken glass. It meant Leonard hadn't opportunistically exploited the transition. He'd built the structure while her father was still healthy, before there was any certainty of succession, which meant either he'd been planning this for years as a precaution, or he'd known something about the company's future that he hadn't shared with the man who trusted him completely. She thought about her father laughing at Leonard's dinner table jokes. She didn't sleep well. On Thursday evening, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I know someone who knows Saul Park. There might be a cleaner way to get what you need without credentials. She stared at the text for a long moment. Then she typed back. When? His response came 3 minutes later. Saturday morning, bring coffee. The machine is broken. She looked at this, then looked at it again. Then, for the first time in a very long while, she smiled at her phone like a person and not a professional. She typed, how do you take it? 3 minutes of silence, black, like the last 3 years. She put the phone down on the couch beside her and sat there for a minute, the smile still on her face, and it was a strange feeling. Not happiness exactly, but the first faint structural suggestion of it, like the framing of a house before the walls go up. It wasn't much, but it was something. And in the life Victoria Hale had been living since her father died, something was more than she'd had in a long time. What she didn't know, and wouldn't know until much later, was that on that same Thursday evening, on the other side of the city, a man named Daniel Price, the signatory on the Westbrook Analytical Partners documents, had received a phone call from Leonard Graves. The call lasted 9 minutes. At the end of it, Price had written down 2 names on a yellow legal pad. He'd circled the first one twice. The second one, the one he hadn't circled, was Ethan Cole. He'd underlined it instead. The coffee she brought on Saturday was from Brennan's, the same cafe on Maple Street where everything had started, which felt either meaningful or like the kind of coincidence that only seems meaningful in retrospect. She ordered his black and hers with a single sugar and carried both cups to the truck and drove to Birchwood Lane with the heat on high and the radio off, running through everything she knew about Saul Park and trying to decide how much she could afford to hope that Ethan's contact would change anything. She didn't let herself think about the Thursday text message, not the tone of it, not the way it had made her smile in her dark apartment like a person who'd forgotten she still could. Ethan was on the porch when she pulled up, sitting on the wooden bench in a canvas work jacket with his elbows on his knees, watching a gray squirrel argue with itself about a walnut in the yard. He looked up when she got out of the car. His eyes went to the 2 cups. Brennan's, she said, handing him his. He looked at it for a moment. You went back there. It's the best coffee in Portland. I wasn't going to stop going because it's where I left a bag full of cash. She sat in the other porch chair. Where's Sophie? My neighbor Ruth. She watches her on Saturday mornings sometimes. Sophie pretends she's doing Ruth a favor. Is she? Ruth is 73 and sharper than anyone I've ever met. Sophie reads to her. I think they both get something out of it. He turned the cup in his hands. Her name is Mara Chen, the person who knows Saul Park. Victoria waited. She works in hospital administration at Maine Med. She and Saul went to UMaine together. They've stayed close. She's not involved in any of this. She doesn't know what you need it for, and I'd like to keep it that way. He said the last part with a directness that wasn't a question. Understood. I told her a friend of mine needed some IT consultation for a network security review. Kept it vague. She's willing to make an introduction over email. Nothing official, just a warm handoff. So when you contact Saul, you're not a stranger. That's... Victoria stopped. Thank you. That's exactly what I needed. Don't thank me yet. Saul still has to agree to help, and he has to do it without knowing the full picture, which means you'll have to be careful about how you frame it. I know how to frame things. I know you do. He said it without irony, just an acknowledgement. That's why I'm not worried about that part. She held her coffee cup and looked out at the yard, where the squirrel had apparently resolved its walnut situation and vanished. The morning was cold and still, the kind of Maine November morning where the light comes in sideways and makes everything look slightly more serious than it is. There's something else, Ethan said. She looked at him. Mara mentioned something when I called her. She said there's been some unusual financial activity at Maine Med. Vendor accounts, getting restructured, consulting payments that don't match any active contracts. He paused. I'm not connecting it to your situation. I might be wrong, but I thought you should know. Victoria set her cup down on the porch railing. The cold air felt suddenly more present. Same structure, she said. Shell companies? I don't know the details. She mentioned it incidentally, said the administration was looking into it. I didn't ask more because I didn't want to explain why I was asking. He looked at her steadily. But Leonard Graves sits on the Maine Med Advisory Board. Has for 6 years. Silence. The information arranged itself in Victoria's mind with a cold, methodical clarity. Leonard wasn't just stealing from Hale Dynamics. He'd built a structure flexible enough to run across multiple institutions simultaneously, which meant the scope was larger than Greer had mapped, which meant the people helping him, Daniel Price, whoever else, were more organized than she'd understood, and which meant she was significantly further behind than she'd thought. How long has he been on the advisory board, she said. Mara's been there 4 years. He was already on it when she started. Victoria picked her coffee back up. Her hands were steady, which surprised her. I need to talk to Greer today. I figured. He stood, pulled his jacket tighter against the cold. I'll send you Mara's contact this afternoon. But Victoria, he said her name in that same careful way he always did, like it was something he wasn't taking for granted. When you talk to Greer, ask him whether anyone else has accessed his preliminary findings. Anyone besides you. She went still. Why? Because if Leonard is as organized as this looks, he doesn't wait for problems to become threats. He addresses them earlier. He met her eyes. And Greer has been sitting on $3.2 million worth of evidence for how long now? 2 weeks and 4 days. She didn't say it out loud. I'll call him right now, she said. She pulled out her phone. It rang 4 times. Then 5. Then voicemail. Greer's recorded voice, professional, clipped. She ended the call and tried the secondary number he'd given her for urgent contact. 3 rings. Then a different voicemail, this one an automated carrier message, generic and unhelpful. She looked at Ethan. His office, she said, already standing. I need to go to his office. Greer Investigations occupied the 3rd floor of a converted warehouse building on Industrial Street, 7 minutes from Birchwood Lane in light traffic. Victoria drove. Ethan sat in the passenger seat without being asked, which she noticed and didn't address. The building's front door was unlocked, which was normal for a Saturday since 3 other small businesses shared the space. The elevator was slow. The 3rd floor hallway smelled like carpet cleaner and old coffee. Greer's office door was closed, but the lock mechanism was showing resistance she hadn't felt on previous visits. A slight give before the catch, the kind that happens when a door has been opened by force and not quite repaired right. She'd grown up with a father who explained things like that. She noticed it the way she noticed the fence footing on Birchwood Lane, as a data point that means something. She pushed the door open. The office was not ransacked in the dramatic way of movies. It was disturbed in the methodical way of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and found it. Greer's desk drawers had been opened and closed again, not left hanging. The filing cabinet in the corner had been relocked. Nothing was thrown. Nothing was broken. Whoever had come here hadn't been angry. They'd been professional. His laptop was gone. So was the external drive he kept plugged into the side of it. Victoria stood in the middle of the office and felt the floor shift under her in a way that had nothing to do with the building's structure. "The report," she said. Her voice came out flat, which meant she was frightened. "His working files, everything." "Not everything," Ethan said from behind her. He was standing just inside the doorway, looking at the room with an attention that took it all in without lingering on any one thing. "If he's good at his job, he's got a backup somewhere that isn't here, paper or cloud, not local. He told me he worked old school, paper copies in the bank." "Then they're in the bank and they're fine." He paused. "Is Greer fine?" She hadn't let herself get there yet. "I don't know." She called him again. No answer. She called Donna, who picked up on the second ring and within 4 minutes of being asked, had located Greer's home address from the intake paperwork he'd signed when she'd arranged the initial consultation. Victoria wrote it down on the back of a gas station receipt from her glove compartment. Greer lived in South Portland, 20 minutes across the bridge. He answered his door in sweatpants and a flannel shirt, and the relief on Victoria's face when she saw him standing upright and uninjured must have been apparent, because his expression shifted immediately from mild weekend morning irritation to something more alert. "What happened?" he said. "Your office," she said. "Someone got into it. The laptop and the external drive are gone." Greer stood very still in his doorway for exactly 3 seconds. Then he stepped back and let them in, and in the controlled, efficient way of a man who has worked in sensitive information long enough to have made contingency plans, he went to a bookshelf in his living room, pulled out a copy of the complete Sherlock Holmes that was, upon examination, not actually a book but a hollow box, and removed from it a USB drive and a folded sheet of handwritten notes. "The full transaction log," he said, handing the drive to Victoria. "Encrypted. Password is the last 4 digits of the account number on the first shell, followed by Westbrook backwards." He looked at her. "Who else knew about this engagement?" "Nobody. Nobody from your side." He looked at Ethan, with the appraising look of someone recalibrating who he was dealing with. "Your father's CFO has been doing this for a while, which means he has someone watching for exactly this kind of inquiry." "How would he know I'd hired you?" Victoria said. "He might not have known it was you specifically. He might have a flag on any investigative inquiry touching those entities. The shells are Delaware registered, which means they show up in certain databases that investigators use. Any search in the right databases gets logged." He paused. "I should have used better access hygiene. That's on me." "How much is on that drive?" Ethan asked. "Everything through last Thursday. $6,400,000, distributed across 7 entities. Payment timestamps, routing paths, receiving accounts." He looked at Victoria. "And I found something new in the last 2 days that I hadn't put in my preliminary report." "What?" 2 of the receiving accounts show outbound transfers to a law firm in Augusta, Caraway and Associates. On paper, it looks like legal fees. But Caraway's primary client list, which I pulled from court records, includes 3 former city officials who were quietly removed from office between 2019 and 2021. He let that land. "I think your CFO has been paying people to stay quiet, not just moving money, buying silence." The room was very still. "How many people?" Victoria said. "At least 4 that I can trace. Possibly more." She thought about what Leonard had said to her in the conference room. "Your father would want us to handle this with discretion." She thought about what discretion looked like when it cost this much money and involved a law firm that specialized in keeping officials quiet. "I need to get this to someone who can act on it," she said. "Federal level, not local. If he's been paying local officials, I can't trust." "FBI field office in Portland handles financial crimes," Greer said. "But you'll want a federal attorney, not just an agent. Someone who can protect the evidence chain and move quickly enough that—" He stopped. "That he doesn't disappear," Victoria finished. "Or accelerate his timetable," Ethan said quietly. Both of them looked at him. "If he knows the investigation is active, and the break-in suggests he does, his most rational move isn't to run yet. Running looks guilty. His most rational move is to complete whatever he's been setting up and then create enough noise about mismanagement at the executive level to make himself look like the responsible party who discovered the problem. He said it calmly, without drama, in the voice of someone thinking through a tactical problem. He needs to make her the story before she can make him the story. Greer looked at Victoria. He's not wrong, Greer said. Victoria knew he wasn't wrong. She'd been feeling it building for weeks. The way Leonard's framing in every board interaction had been subtly, consistently positioning her as unstable, overwhelmed, grieving. It hadn't seemed sinister in isolation. Now it assembled itself into a shape she should have seen sooner. I have a name, she said. A federal contact. My father used him years ago for a compliance review. He was FBI then. He's DOJ now. She was already pulling out her phone. David Marsh. If he's still at the same field office, call him, Ethan said. Today, not Monday, she called. Marsh picked up, which was either good fortune or the kind of thing that happens when the universe decides you've waited long enough. She gave him a condensed version, enough to establish urgency, not so much that she lost him in the first 60 seconds. He asked 3 sharp questions, all of which she answered cleanly. At the end he said, I need the documentation. Can you get it to me securely today? She said yes before she'd fully worked out how. He gave her an address and a 2-hour window. She ended the call, looked at Ethan. I need to get the documentation from the safe deposit box, she said. The physical copies. The bank is in Falmouth, 40 minutes north. And after Marsh receives it, you're protected, Ethan said. It wasn't quite a question. After Marsh receives it, it's out of my hands and into a federal process. She paused. Which means Leonard's leverage over the situation disappears. Unless he moves before you get there. She didn't have an answer for that. She looked at the USB drive in her hand, the hollow book on Greer's shelf, the gray Saturday morning light coming through the window, and she made the calculation that a woman running out of time makes. Imperfect action, now over perfect inaction later. Let's go, she said. They took Ethan's truck because Victoria's car was too recognizable. She'd realized this, and he'd already been thinking it, and they'd arrived at the same conclusion at almost the same moment without discussion, which she registered in some peripheral part of her mind as the specific efficiency of 2 people who have started to think along the same lines. The drive to Falmouth was quiet for the first 10 minutes. The highway ran north along the coast, and in the gray November light the water to the right was the color of old pewter, flat and wide and cold. Victoria had the USB drive in her coat pocket and both hands in her lap. She was running through contingencies the way her father had taught her. Worst case, second worst case, least bad option. And she was aware that her list of acceptable options had gotten shorter in the last 2 hours. You were in forward surgical units, she said, not looking at him. Which deployment? A pause. 2. Kandahar 2013, then Mosul Support 2016. How long total? 3 years active, 14 months deployed. And before that? Medical school? Johns Hopkins. She looked at him now. He was watching the road with the particular attention of a driver who was also watching everything else. Johns Hopkins, she said. I was 22. I knew what I wanted to do. He said it without pride, just fact. My father thought I should go into private practice. Orthopedics, something lucrative. I told him I wanted to go where the work was hard. And it was. Yes. He changed lanes smoothly, checking the mirror in that habitual, complete way. It was also the most important thing I've ever done, which is a complicated thing to have lost. She looked at the road ahead. You haven't lost it. The license is a piece of paper you suspended voluntarily. You haven't lost the skill. You haven't lost the instinct. She paused. You proved both on Wednesday outside that clinic. You prove it every Wednesday. He said nothing for a moment. It's not the same as... I know it's not the same. I'm not saying it's the same. She turned to look at him directly. I'm saying you're still a doctor, Ethan. You're just one who's afraid to go back to being one officially, because being official means it's real again. And if it's real again, you have to grieve what you lost when Claire died. She said it quietly, without cruelty. And you're not ready for that yet. The truck was very quiet. He didn't answer, but the line of his jaw did something she'd learned to read as the equivalent, in another person, of a long exhale. I'm overstepping, she said. A little, he said. But you're not wrong. She turned back to the window. The water was still there, gray and cold and unimpressed by either of them. They drove the rest of the way to Falmouth without talking, and the silence was the kind that comes after something true has been said and doesn't need to be immediately resolved. The The bank was a small branch on a commercial strip between a dry cleaner and a dental office, the kind of place designed to look trustworthy through sheer blandness. Victoria's safe deposit box was in the back room under a fluorescent light that buzzed faintly, which was either a coincidence or the universe's way of indicating this was not a triumphant moment. The box held what Greer had originally provided, plus what she'd added over the past 2 weeks. Printed transaction logs, annotated with her own handwritten notes in red ink. The shell company and corporation documents she'd obtained through a separate search. The original consulting contracts from March and April, with the signatures she'd had quietly compared to a handwriting sample by a forensic consultant Greer had recommended. 2 affidavits from former Hale Dynamics employees who had left the company under circumstances that looked in retrospect like managed exits. She put everything into a flat courier envelope and sealed it. On the drive back south toward Portland, her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost ignored it, then answered. Ms. Hale. The voice was male, older, unhurried in the way of someone who believes they control the timeline of every conversation they enter. This is Daniel Price. She said nothing. Beside her, she felt rather than saw Ethan go still. I think we should talk, Price said, before this situation becomes something nobody can manage. I don't know who you are, she said, keeping her voice completely even. A pause. Brief amusement in it. I think you do. I think your investigator has been quite thorough, which is actually why I'm calling. I want you to understand that what Mr. Graves has been building isn't something that can simply be disassembled by handing documents to a federal contact. Her grip on the phone tightened. He knew about Marsh. There are people involved whose cooperation ensures a particular stability, Price continued. Officials. People in institutions. If you introduce federal scrutiny without the right preparatory work, the disruption will be considerably broader than you intend. And some of that disruption will touch things that are currently protecting people you care about. She heard it clearly. People you care about. Not a vague threat, a pointed one. I'd encourage you to take the next 24 hours and think carefully, he said. I'll call again tomorrow morning. The line went dead. Victoria lowered the phone. Her heart was going faster than she wanted it to. A rapid, insistent beat against her sternum that she was working to keep off her face. He knew about Marsh, she said. I heard. Ethan's voice was flat and focused. How? Leonard has someone monitoring my phone, or Marsh's contacts. She pressed her hand against the courier envelope in her lap. He knows I have documentation. He's trying to create enough fear that I pause. Will you? She looked at him. No. Something in his face settled. Good. But the threat about people I care about... She stopped. Ethan was already 2 steps ahead. Sophie's at Ruth's, he said, and his hand was already on his phone. Ruth answered on the 3rd ring. Sophie was fine, currently winning at checkers, extremely annoyed about it. Ethan told her to keep the front door locked, and not to mention to anyone that Sophie was there, and did it in a tone that Ruth, who was 73 and had apparently lived enough to know when to ask questions and when not to, accepted without comment. He put the phone down. He exhaled once, controlled. She's fine, he said, as much to himself as to Victoria. I know. She put her hand briefly on his arm, just for a second, and then removed it. We get the documents to Marsh. We do it now, before Price calls whoever he calls next. Ethan nodded. He drove. David Marsh was a compact, precise man in his mid-50s with the specific patience of someone who has spent decades working cases that move slower than he'd like. He received the courier envelope at a private address, an apartment above a bookstore in the west end of Portland that Victoria strongly suspected was a field office disguised as a residence, examined the contents for 11 minutes without speaking, and then looked up at Victoria with the expression of someone who has just had a suspicion confirmed. This is enough to open, he said. This is more than enough, actually. He set the affidavits down carefully. The main med connection. Did your investigator document the parallel structure? Not yet. It's on the USB drive, partial. I'll need the rest, and I'll need your investigator available for contact. His name is Greer. His office was broken into this morning, laptop taken. Marsh looked up sharply. Today? We found it around 9. Then we're on an accelerated timetable. He closed the envelope. Miss Hale, I need you to understand that from the moment I open a formal investigation, I cannot guarantee how quickly we can move. These things require proper construction, or they fall apart in court. What I can tell you is that we will move as fast as legally possible. He paused. In the meantime, if this Price calls you again, do not engage, do not respond. Record it if you can and send me the recording. He implied there are people with influence who could disrupt the process if I moved without. I know what he implied. Marsh's voice was measured. It's a standard pressure tactic. It means they know what they've built is vulnerable. If their positions were actually protected, they wouldn't need to threaten you into pausing. She held that. So they're scared. Not yet, but they should be. He stood. Go home. Don't go to the office. Don't contact Leonard Graves. Let me work. They left the bookstore apartment and walked out onto the West End street, where the Saturday afternoon had gone cold and pale, the kind of cold that doesn't leave until April. Victoria stood on the sidewalk with her coat pulled across her chest, and the strange, hollowed-out feeling of a person who has done the thing they were afraid to do and is now simply waiting to find out if it was enough. It's done, Ethan said. He was standing beside her, not touching her, just present. It started, she said. It's not done. Fair. She looked up the empty street. A woman walked a dog. A car passed slowly. Portland on a Saturday afternoon, ordinary and unhurried, indifferent to the fact that 6 years of fraud and silence and quietly ruined careers were now inside a federal envelope in a bookstore apartment. I want to go check on Sophie, she said. Yeah, he said. Me too. They drove back to Birchwood Lane, and the squirrel was back in the yard, and Sophie was on the porch with her rabbit, and a chapter she'd apparently been saving, and she looked up when they got out of the truck with an expression that was attempting nonchalance and not quite managing it. You were gone a long time, she said. We had things to do, Ethan said. Ruth beat me at checkers. I told you she would. You could have warned me sooner. She looked at Victoria with those clear brown eyes. Are you staying for dinner? Victoria looked at Ethan. He was looking at his daughter with the complicated tenderness of a man who contains more than he shows. I can make pasta, he said, to neither of them in particular. It's not impressive, but it's food. Pasta's good, Victoria said. Sophie nodded, apparently satisfied, and went back to her book. Ethan held the front door, and Victoria walked into the house that smelled like wood and laundry and coffee. And for 1 hour, they didn't talk about Leonard Graves or Daniel Price or federal envelopes or $6 million or any of the things that were waiting for them on the other side of the evening. They ate pasta. Sophie talked about checkers and Ruth and a chapter of A Wrinkle in Time that had given her feelings she couldn't name. Ethan washed dishes. Victoria dried them again because she reached for the towel before she thought about it again. And this time Ethan didn't comment on it, just handed her the bowls one at a time in the same comfortable rhythm as before. After dinner, Victoria sat with her coat on in the entryway putting on her shoes, and Sophie came around the corner in pajamas holding her rabbit and looked at her with those unsparing eyes. Are you going to come back? She asked. It was a direct question, not a particularly loaded one. Sophie seemed to deal in direct questions the way other children dealt in stuffed animals, as essential items. Yes, Victoria said. Okay. Sophie seemed to find this sufficient. Good night. She disappeared back down the hallway. Victoria tied her shoe. She stood. Ethan was leaning against the wall with his hands in his pockets, watching her with that steady, unreadable look. She likes you, he said. I like her. She picked up her bag. She got her directness from somewhere. Her mother, he said. And then, quietly, like he was testing whether he could say it without it costing him too much. Claire would have asked you that same question about 5 minutes into knowing you. It was the first time he'd said Claire's name to her voluntarily. She held it carefully, the way you hold something fragile that someone has handed you unexpectedly. She sounds like someone worth knowing, Victoria said. She was. He looked at the floor for a moment, then back up. Drive safe. I will. She walked to her car in the dark, and the cold air hit her face, and from somewhere across the water came the low, distant sound of a ship's horn, and she sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine, not thinking about Leonard or Price or federal investigations, just holding the particular weight of an evening that had been, despite everything, quietly real. Her phone buzzed. A text from Marsh. Documentation received and logged. Chain of custody established. Stand by. She read it twice. Then she started the car. 2 miles away, in a hotel room overlooking the harbor, Daniel Price ended a call and looked at the name underlined on his yellow legal pad. His next call was to a man who handled what Price politely referred to as compliance issues, the kind of compliance that didn't go through lawyers. He gave the man 2 addresses. The first was Victoria Hale's downtown apartment. The second was 14 Birchwood Lane. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. Victoria had not been sleeping. She'd been sitting at her kitchen table with her laptop open to a blank document and a cup of tea gone cold, running through every variable she could think of and finding the exercise less calming than she'd hoped. Marsh had confirmed receipt. The chain of custody was established. Greer was reachable and had already been contacted by Marsh's team. Everything that could be done on Saturday night had been done. This was the part she was bad at. The waiting. Her phone lit up. Ethan's number. She answered before the second ring. What's wrong? It wasn't a question. His tone and the single word he'd said, her name, had told her everything she needed about the register of the call. There's a car outside, he said. His voice was low and controlled, the kind of controlled that costs something. Dark sedan, no plates I can read from here. It's been parked across the street for 40 minutes. Hasn't moved. She stood up. Sophie, asleep. I checked. A pause. Victoria, I want you to leave your apartment. What? Not in 10 minutes. Now. Pack what you need for one night, nothing that takes more than 5 minutes, and get out. His voice was steady, but the steadiness had an edge under it, like a surface held flat by deliberate pressure. If Price made calls tonight, he made more than one. She was already moving toward the bedroom. You think someone's outside my building, too? I think we handed documents to a federal agent 6 hours ago, and Price told you to wait 24 hours, which means whatever he's planning happens inside that window. She was pulling clothes into a bag with one hand, phone pressed to her ear with the other, her heart running faster than she wanted to acknowledge. Where do I go? Not here. Not anywhere connected to me or Greer. He thought for a second. Donna. Donna lives in... I know. Call her. Tell her you need her couch for one night, and that you'll explain in the morning. Don't tell her anything else on the phone. Another pause. Do you have the USB drive? Yes. Keep it on you, not in the bag. Ethan. I know. He knew what she hadn't finished saying, that this had escalated past what either of them had prepared for, that the careful, methodical process of building a case had just collided with the less methodical reality of people who protected their interests with cars outside houses at 2 a.m. I know. Just go. She went. The lobby of her building was empty, which should have been reassuring and wasn't. She took the stairs to the parking garage instead of the front entrance, cut through to the adjacent building's side exit, a route she'd learned when she'd been working late enough that the front lobby made her feel exposed, and she'd started varying her exits out of a habit she'd never examined, and came out on a side street 2 blocks from the main entrance. There was, in fact, a dark car parked in front of her building. She didn't look at it directly. She turned left, walked 2 blocks, called a cab from around the corner, and sat on a cold concrete step outside a closed pharmacy waiting for it with her bag on her lap and her coat pulled tight, feeling the specific grinding unpleasantness of a situation that has moved beyond your control. Donna, to her enormous credit, answered on the second ring, said, okay, when Victoria said she needed the couch, said, I'll put the key under the mat, when Victoria said she'd explain in the morning, and asked exactly 0 questions. This was, Victoria reflected in the back of the cab, why Donna had lasted 4 years in a role that would have ground most people down in 18 months. She texted Ethan from the cab, I'm out, going to Donna's. Then, after a moment, are you okay? His response came 90 seconds later, still watching the car, still here. A pause, then, Sophie's fine, still asleep. She put the phone in her coat pocket and looked out the cab window at the Portland streets, dark and empty, at 2:30 in the morning. The harbor somewhere to the right reflecting the distant lights of the bridge, and she thought about a man sitting alone in a dark house watching a car across the street and deciding not to wake his daughter. She thought about the particular loneliness of that. She slept 3 hours on Donna's couch, which was small and had a spring that dug into her left shoulder blade, and woke at 6 to the smell of coffee and the sound of Donna in the kitchen being deliberately quiet, which was its own kind of kindness. Donna was 44. Practical in the way that people who have managed other people's chaos professionally become practical. She made decisions quickly, didn't catastrophize, and had a gift for identifying the one useful action in a complicated situation. She put coffee in front of Victoria, sat down across from her and said, tell me what I actually need to know. So Victoria told her. Not everything. Not Ethan. Not the full shape of what had grown between the two of them over the past weeks. But the essential architecture, Leonard, the shells, Greer's findings, the documents now in Marsh's hands, Price's call, the cars. Donna listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Victoria finished, Donna was quiet for a moment. Leonard called me on Friday, she said. Victoria went still. He asked whether you'd been in contact with any outside financial consultants, said it was related to a compliance review he was conducting. Donna's voice was even, but her jaw was tight. I told him I didn't manage your external contacts and he'd need to ask you directly. You didn't tell me. I thought it was normal board business. I didn't know. Donna stopped. I'm sorry. Don't be. You didn't know. Victoria wrapped her hands around the mug. Did he ask anything else? He asked if you'd been spending time outside the office with anyone new. I said I didn't keep track of your personal schedule. A pause. He thanked me and hung up. So Leonard had been building a picture, not just of the investigation, but of Victoria's support structure, who she trusted, who she spent time with. She thought about Price's second phone call, the man who handled compliance issues, the two addresses he'd been given. Her phone buzzed. Ethan, the car is gone. Left around 5 a.m. I need to tell you something. She called him immediately. There were two of them, he said. He sounded tired, which meant he hadn't slept. I went out around 4:30. Just walked to the end of the block and back. Nothing confrontational. One man in the front, one in the back. Professional posture, not local security. A pause. They weren't there to watch the house, Victoria. They were waiting for a signal. A signal to do what? I don't know. They left before it came. He exhaled slowly. But I want Sophie out of here today. I want her somewhere that isn't connected to any of this. Your father? A long pause. She heard him deciding. He's in Bangor, Ethan said. 2 hours north. He doesn't know anything about this situation, and I'd like to keep it that way, but Sophie loves him, and his house has a yard, and... He stopped. Yeah, my father. I can have someone drive her, discreetly. I'll take her myself. His voice was firm on that point. I'm not putting her in a car with someone she doesn't know. Then I'll come with you. You shouldn't be driving 2 hours to Bangor and 2 hours back alone right now. A pause. You don't have to... Ethan. She said his name the way he sometimes said hers, carefully, without aggression, but with enough weight to end the sentence he was constructing. Let me come. He was quiet for a moment. Be here by 8. Sophie, informed at 7:15 that she was going to Grandpa's for a few days, received this information with a child's instinctive awareness that something was happening that she wasn't being told, combined with a pragmatic recognition that Grandpa's meant homemade waffles and a dog named Biscuit, and a general relaxation of the rules around screen time. How many days, she asked, sitting on her bed while Ethan packed her bag. Few days, maybe a week. Will you come get me? Of course I will. She watched him fold a sweater with the focus of a child running a quiet diagnostic on her parent. Are you okay? I'm okay. You look tired. I am tired. I'll sleep when you're settled. He zipped the bag and sat down beside her on the bed. She was holding her rabbit, which she didn't always do, and the fact that she was holding it now told him she was more anxious than her voice was letting on. Hey. She looked up at him. We're fine, he said. I need you to stay with Grandpa for a bit while I sort out something with work. It's boring grown-up stuff, and it'll be over soon. Is it the thing with Victoria's company? He looked at her. What do you know about that? You talk more quietly when she calls. And you had papers on the table you didn't want her to see. She said it with the infuriating accuracy of a child who notices everything. I'm not a baby, Dad. I know you're not. He put his arm around her and she leaned against his side, rabbit tucked under her chin. I know. Is she in trouble? She's handling it. Are you helping her? He was quiet for a moment. Yeah. Sophie seemed to find this sufficient. Good, she said, in a tone that conveyed, obviously you should help her. Stop making it complicated. Victoria was waiting in the truck when they came outside at 8, and she had brought 3 things. A large coffee for Ethan, a hot chocolate for Sophie in a to-go cup with a lid, and a copy of From the Mixed-Up Files of Mrs. Basil E. Frankweiler that she'd had Donna pick up from the 24-hour pharmacy that kept a rack of paperbacks near the register. Sophie looked at the book, then at Victoria, then at her father. She's good at books, she told him, and got in the back seat. Ethan looked at Victoria over the roof of the truck. He looked like a man who hadn't slept and was carrying something heavy, but had decided not to show it, which she recognized because she was doing the same thing. Thank you, he said quietly. She got in the passenger seat without making anything of it. The drive to Bangor took 2 hours and 20 minutes because they hit a patch of ice on the interstate north of Augusta that forced everyone to slow to 40, and the sky overhead had gone the particular white-gray of a Maine sky, debating whether to produce snow. Sophie read her book in the back seat with focused absorption, surfacing occasionally to ask questions about words she didn't know. Peripatetic, clandestine, confiscate, which Ethan answered with the reflexive accuracy of a man who had read to his daughter every night since she was old enough to hold a book. Victoria watched the road and felt, intermittently, the buzz of her phone against her thigh as messages came in. She checked them at intervals. 2 from Donna relaying that the board had received an unscheduled memo from Leonard requesting an emergency meeting Monday morning. 1 from Marsh, reviewing documents. We'll have update by noon. Do not initiate contact with Graves or Price. Then, at 9:40, a call from a number she didn't recognize. She answered, a man's voice, older, ragged at the edges in the way of someone who had recently been frightened. Is this Victoria Hale? Who's calling? My name is Ray Kowalski. I was the senior accountant at Hale Dynamics from 2014 until March of this year. A pause. His voice had a slight shake in it that he wasn't managing to suppress. I was told to keep quiet. I've been keeping quiet for 8 months. But my son... He stopped. My son was in a car accident in September. A bad one. And the police said it was a mechanical failure, but his car was serviced 3 weeks before and it was fine. He's fine now. He recovered. But his voice broke slightly and he pulled it back. I need to talk to someone. I need to tell someone what I know. Victoria's hand tightened on the phone. In the driver's seat, Ethan glanced at her once and then returned his attention to the icy road, giving her space. Mr. Kowalski, she said carefully, I need you to do exactly one thing right now. I need you to call a federal agent named David Marsh. She gave him the number. Tell him everything you just told me, plus everything you know about the consulting contracts and the shell accounts. He's expecting calls like yours. Will I... He hesitated. My son. If you talk to Marsh, you're inside a federal investigation. That's protection, Mr. Kowalski. That's significantly more protection than silence has given you so far. A long pause. Okay, he said quietly. Okay. She ended the call, sat for a moment. Another witness, Ethan said. Senior accountant. He's been silent for 8 months because of what happened to his son. Ethan absorbed this. Price. Probably people Price hired. She looked at the road. This is bigger than I understood. Leonard didn't just build a theft structure. He built a containment structure around it. Witnesses, officials, institutions. She paused. He's been doing this for years, and my father never knew. You can't know that for certain, Ethan said. No. She pressed the USB drive through the fabric of her coat pocket. But I'm going to find out. Ethan's father, James Cole, was a broad-shouldered man of 64 with Ethan's same dark eyes and a quieter version of his same careful attention. He met them in the driveway of a white clapboard house on a residential street in Bangor with a dog of indeterminate breed named Biscuit, and an expression that took in his son's face and clocked something wrong immediately, with the accuracy of a man who had been reading this particular face for 32 years. He didn't ask. He hugged Sophie, scratched Biscuit, and looked at Victoria with a brief, assessing look that managed to convey both, I'm glad someone's with him, and I have questions without saying either. Come in, he said. I'll make waffles. Sophie's face performed the specific joy of a child receiving exactly what was promised. Inside, while Sophie and Biscuit negotiated the terms of their reunion in the living room, and James operated the waffle iron with practiced ease, Ethan and his father stood in the kitchen in the particular arrangement of 2 men who know each other well enough to communicate without much talking. James put a cup of coffee in front of his son. Ethan drank it. How long does she stay? James said, keeping his voice low. Few days, maybe a week, until something I'm involved in gets resolved. Involved how? Helping someone I know navigate a bad situation. James looked at him over his own coffee cup. The someone is standing in my living room. Yes. A pause. She's good with Sophie. I know. James was quiet for a moment. You look like hell. I know that too. When's the last time you slept? Ethan didn't answer, which was its own answer. James put a hand on his son's shoulder briefly, the same brief, firm gesture Ethan had used with the teenager outside the clinic, and then went back to the waffles. I'll call you every night, Ethan told Sophie at the door, 40 minutes later. She had maple syrup on her sleeve and Biscuit was already her shadow. You don't go anywhere with anyone except Grandpa. If anyone calls asking about me or about our house, You come find Grandpa immediately and you don't say anything. Like a protocol, Sophie said. Exactly like a protocol. Sophie. She hugged him with the fierce specificity of a child who doesn't perform feelings, but has them in full. Come back fast, she said into his shoulder. Always, he said. He held her for a moment longer than he meant to. Victoria watched from the truck and looked away, because it felt like something she shouldn't see. Not because it was private exactly, but because it was so unguarded that looking at it felt like taking something that wasn't offered. He climbed back into the truck. He started the engine. He pulled out of the driveway and drove 2 blocks, and then stopped at a red light. And when the light went green, he didn't move immediately, and Victoria didn't say anything. And after about 4 seconds, he exhaled slowly through his nose and drove. She'll be fine, Victoria said. I know. His voice was even. I know she will. But you hate leaving her. Every time. He said it simply, without self-consciousness. Every time since Claire. She looked at him. He was watching the road with his usual careful attention, but there was something around the edges of him now that wasn't careful at all. A tiredness that went down further than a missed night's sleep. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been afraid for someone they love and is trying not to let the fear make them smaller than they need to be. When Claire was sick, she said carefully, you were still operating. For the first 8 months. Then I took a leave. And Sophie? Claire's mother came to stay. She was good. She is good. He paused. Sophie doesn't really remember the last few months. She was 3. I'm glad for that. He said it with a flatness that was clearly a decision. Not coldness, just the particular way a person talks about something that still has edges. I'm not glad for much about that year, but I'm glad for that. Victoria said nothing. She had learned over the past weeks that Ethan's silences after something like that were not invitations for comfort. They were him processing, out loud, in the only way he knew how. She would have liked you, he said, after a while. Victoria looked at him. Claire. He said it without looking away from the road. She didn't have a lot of patience for the kind of person who performs being good. She liked people who were just actually trying. He paused. You're actually trying. It was, in its quiet way, more than he'd ever said directly. She felt it land somewhere in her chest, not painfully, but with the specific weight of something real. Thank you, she said. He nodded once. They drove. They were 40 minutes south of Bangor on the long straight stretch of I-95, where the trees close in on both sides, and there's nothing between you and the horizon except highway and November sky, when the black SUV appeared in the rear view mirror. Ethan saw it first. She knew because she saw his eyes go to the mirror in that habitual way and stay there. Don't turn around, he said. She didn't. How long? Since the exit for Vassalboro. 8 minutes. Could be coincidence. It's not. She'd learned enough about how he assessed things to trust that. How many? 1 vehicle. Can't tell how many inside from here. His hands were steady on the wheel. His voice had shifted. Not louder, not faster, just cleaner, the way a frequency gets cleaner when you remove the interference. She'd heard this voice once before, in the clinic with the teenager, when he was doing something he knew how to do. When we get to the Waterville interchange, I'm going to take the exit. I want you to call Marsh. She had her phone out before he finished the sentence. Marsh picked up on the first ring, which meant he was already working. She gave him the highway, their position, the vehicle behind them. He told her to stay on the line, said something to someone in the room with him that she couldn't make out, and came back 30 seconds later. I need you to stay on 95 through Augusta, he said. Don't exit. There's a state police post at mile marker 112. I'm calling them now. Can you make Augusta? How far? She asked Ethan. 20 minutes, she told Marsh. I'll have someone there in 15. Drive the speed limit. Don't give them a reason to accelerate. The next 20 minutes were the longest Victoria had ever experienced in a moving vehicle. The SUV maintained its distance, close enough to be a statement, far enough to deny surveillance if challenged. She watched it in the side mirror with the peripheral awareness of someone trying not to appear to watch it, which was exhausting and not entirely successful. Ethan drove with the exact, deliberate control of a man who has been in worse situations than this and knows that panic costs you the options that calm preserves. She watched his hands on the wheel. Steady, not gripping. Talk to me about something, she said. He glanced at her briefly. What? Anything. Just talk. A pause. Sophie's been asking about getting a fish, like a fish. An actual fish with a tank. She's been researching it for 2 months. I found a notebook where she'd written down the different types and their care requirements. He kept his eyes on the road. She made a pros and cons list. The pros included teaches responsibility and peaceful to watch. The cons list was empty. She made herself a con-free argument. She's 7. She's already practicing. Victoria almost laughed. The almost laugh was more useful than it had any right to be. It reminded her that there was a world beyond the black shape in the side mirror, a world that contained children making con-free arguments for fish tanks, and that they were trying to get back to it. The state police cruiser appeared at the Augusta interchange with its lights on, pulling out from the shoulder as they passed. It positioned itself between Ethan's truck and the SUV with the deliberate calm of an interposing body. The SUV slowed. Then it took the next exit. Ethan exhaled slowly. One hand came off the wheel briefly, then went back. "Marsh," Victoria said into the phone. "I see it," Marsh said. He had someone tracking it. She didn't ask how. Plate comes back to a rental, enterprise office in Portland, registered yesterday. A pause. "We're running the renter now. Ms. Hale, I need you to come directly to a location I'm going to send you. Don't stop anywhere." "I understand." "Mr. Cole is with you?" She looked at Ethan. "Yes." "Good. Bring him." A pause that felt deliberate. "I've been reading his file. I could use someone who thinks the way he thinks." She ended the call, looked at Ethan. He had heard enough of it. "He wants us both there," she said. "I heard. He said he's been reading your file." Something moved in Ethan's face, not quite surprise, more the expression of a person who suspected this might happen and has decided how they feel about it. "Of course he has," he said. "Potam. Marsh's actual field office, not the bookstore apartment, but a proper space in a building downtown that had the fluorescent-lit, under-decorated quality of a government room everywhere, was already occupied when they arrived. 2 agents Victoria didn't know. A woman from the DOJ field office who introduced herself simply as Chen and had the focused quiet of someone several steps ahead of everyone else in the room. Greer, who had apparently been there for 2 hours already and looked like he hadn't slept either. And Kowalski, the accountant, sitting in a chair against the wall with both hands around a styrofoam coffee cup, looking like a man who has finally put down something very heavy and is not yet sure his hands remember what empty feels like. Marsh looked up when they came in. He looked at Ethan with the brief, assessing look of someone confirming a detail they've already processed. "Mr. Cole," he said, "Agent Marsh. You have medical training and field experience, and you've been helping Ms. Hale navigate a live situation while keeping your daughter safe. I appreciate that." It was not a preamble to anything, just an acknowledgement. "Sit down." He briefed them in the flat, sequential way of a man who respects other people's time. The documents had been processed overnight. The shell structure was fully mapped. 7 entities, $6.4 million, 4 years of operation. Kowalski had given them a detailed account of the internal mechanics, including specific instances of threatened employees. 2 of the officials connected to Caraway and Associates had already been identified and were under separate observation. Daniel Price had a prior federal fraud charge from 2009, reduced to a fine, which meant he was known. And Leonard Graves had, at 7 this morning, submitted a request to the Hale Dynamics Board for an emergency vote to place the company's executive functions under temporary CFO oversight, due to, in his memo's language, concerns about the CEO's fitness to manage the current financial crisis. "He's moving," Ethan said. "He's moving," Marsh confirmed, "which is exactly what we wanted. People in motion make mistakes that people standing still don't." He looked at Victoria. "I need your board members' direct contacts. Specifically, anyone who hasn't been in contact with Graves in the past 48 hours. I want to brief them before Monday's meeting." "Patricia Howe," Victoria said immediately. "She's clean, and she's been uncomfortable for weeks. She'll listen. Get her on the phone today." He outlined the rest of it in the same methodical way. A federal warrant for Graves' financial records was being prepared and would be executed before close of business Monday. Price was being tracked. The rental car from the interstate had been registered to a man with 2 prior assault charges and known connections to a private security firm that had, in the past, handled sensitive situations for corporate clients. When Marsh finished, he looked at the room for a moment. "There is one more thing," he said. He didn't soften his voice, which told Victoria it wasn't good. An hour ago, Mr. Graves contacted Portland Family Services. He filed a report claiming that his colleague's personal investigation into company finances had uncovered evidence that a third party, a man named Ethan Cole, had been inappropriately involved in influencing the CEO's decision-making, and that this same individual was a former military officer with documented psychological instability who had voluntarily surrendered his medical license, and that his minor daughter, Ethan, went absolutely still. Maybe in a domestic situation that warranted investigation. The room was very quiet. Victoria looked at Ethan. His face had gone to a place she hadn't seen before, not the controlled neutral of his usual reserve, but something harder and colder and more exposed, because the controlled neutral is what a person uses when the danger is manageable, and this was the face underneath it. "They're going after Sophie," he said. His voice was level. The levelness cost him something. "It's a false report," Marsh said. "We know that. But the family services process has its own timeline," Ethan said, "and doesn't wait for verification." "Correct." He stood up. Not abruptly. He stood the way he did everything, with physical control. But the motion had a kind of contained urgency that Victoria felt from across the room. "My daughter is in Bangor," he said. "I know. I'd like to have. My daughter is in Bangor with my father and a dog, and no idea that someone just filed a fake welfare report about her home." His voice stayed even. It cost him more now. She could see it in the line of his jaw. "I need to go get her." "Mr. Cole, what Leonard Graves is or isn't doing to Victoria's company is a federal matter, and I trust you to handle it. My daughter is my matter." He looked at Marsh directly. "I'm asking you professionally whether there is anything that requires my physical presence in this room in the next 2 hours." Marsh looked at him for a moment. Then he looked at Victoria. "Go," Marsh said, "but I want you reachable." Victoria was already standing. She drove back to Bangor this time, because Ethan's hands were still steady, but his eyes had a quality she'd never seen in them. Not panic, nothing that dramatic, just a look of profound, barely contained dread, the specific terror of a parent confronting the thing they most cannot afford to happen. She recognized it the way you recognize something you've read about, but never seen. It was everything he'd protected himself against by building a small, careful life and keeping Sophie at the center of it, and it was threatening to become real. He called his father from the passenger seat. James answered on the second ring. "Family Services may be contacting you," Ethan said, keeping his voice measured. "It's a false report. Don't let anyone in the house without identification, and if someone comes to the door, call me immediately." A pause on James's end. "Is Sophie? She's fine. She doesn't know about any of this." "Okay." James's voice had gone quiet and solid, the voice of a man who has just rearranged his priorities. "I'll stay by the door." "Thank you." He ended the call. He looked out the passenger window. His hands were in his lap. "She's fine," Victoria said quietly. "I know." He pressed the back of his wrist against his mouth for a moment. A brief, unguarded gesture she pretended not to see. "They used her to slow me down, to pull me out of wherever I was most useful." He lowered his hand. It's a good move, tactically. I hate that it's a good move. It's not going to work. No." He looked at the road ahead. "But it shows what Leonard is willing to do. He put my daughter in the middle of this without..." He stopped, started again. "She's 7. She has nothing to do with any of this." "I know. This is on me," he said. "I let you into my house. I let Sophie see me help you, and that created a vector." "Don't," she said. "Victoria, don't." She kept her eyes on the road, her voice firm but not hard. "You didn't create a vector. A corrupt man who has been buying silence for years and threatening witnesses created this. You made a choice to help someone who needed help, which is what you do. It's what you've always done. It's why you didn't walk past that cafe table. Don't take credit for what Leonard did." He was quiet. "She will be fine," Victoria said, "and we are going to go get her and bring her home, and this will be over." "You don't know that." "No, but I'm choosing to believe it until I have evidence otherwise." She glanced at him. "Occupy the ground you're standing on." He looked at her. "You said that to Sophie once," she said. "When she was worried about starting a new school year, she told me." Something shifted in his face. The cold, contained dread didn't disappear, but it became something she could see him working with rather than working against. "She talks too much," he said. "She talks exactly the right amount," Victoria said. "She got that from somewhere too." They drove in silence for a few miles. The sky had made its decision about snow. Light flakes, not serious, just enough to require the wipers. Victoria drove steadily, both hands on the wheel, and didn't say anything else because she'd said what was needed, and adding to it would only dilute it. "When this is over," Ethan said finally, to the window, to the snow, to no one in particular. I've been thinking about the license. She waited. Not going back to the OR. Not yet. But there's a rural emergency medicine initiative that Maine Med has been trying to staff for 2 years. They can't get physicians to commit to the hours and the location. He paused. I talked to Mara about it. Before all of this. She said the position is still open. Victoria kept her eyes on the road. That sounds like exactly the kind of thing that would be hard and matter to people other than you, she said. I was quiet for a moment. Then very quietly, yeah. They pulled into his father's driveway 40 minutes later. James was on the porch before they'd stopped the engine, and Sophie appeared behind him in the doorway with Biscuit at her feet. And when she saw Ethan's face through the windshield, she pushed past her grandfather and ran down the porch steps in her socks, across the cold, wet yard, and hit him around the middle with the full force of a 7-year-old who has decided that a feeling is going to happen and is not going to be managed. He caught her. He went down on one knee in the wet grass and held her with both arms and pressed his face against the top of her head. And Victoria stood by the truck and looked at the bare trees at the edge of the yard and gave them a moment that wasn't for her. When she heard Sophie's voice say, muffled against her father's jacket, "You came fast," and heard Ethan say, "Always," something in Victoria's chest did something she hadn't prepared for. She told herself, carefully and deliberately, not to want things she couldn't account for. She'd been very organized about this. She'd kept her reasons for coming to Birchwood Lane tidy and explicable. Standing in a wet yard in Bangor, watching a man hold his daughter in November snow, she was aware that the organization had come completely undone. She looked at the trees for a while longer. James Cole came to stand beside her, close enough to speak quietly. "I don't know everything that's happening," he said. He handed her a cup of coffee he'd apparently carried out from the house. "But I know my son, and I know what he looks like when he stopped running from something." She looked at him. "I haven't seen that in 3 years," James said. He looked at his son and his granddaughter in the yard. "Whatever you've done, thank you." She didn't know what to say to that. So she held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the yard and the snow and the 2 people in it, and she let the moment be what it was without trying to name it. It was enough. For now, it was more than enough. The warrant was executed on Monday at 11:14 in the morning. Victoria knew the exact time because she was sitting in Patricia Howe's office on the 12th floor of a building 3 blocks from Hale Dynamics, when her phone buzzed with a text from Marsh that read simply, "It's done." She looked at the screen for a moment, then put the phone face down on the table, and Patricia, who had spent the previous 40 minutes listening to everything Victoria had been carrying for the past 3 months, with the focused, increasingly grim attention of a woman, recalibrating everything she thought she understood about someone she'd worked alongside for 6 years, looked at her carefully. "That's the warrant?" Patricia said. Yes. Patricia sat back in her chair. She was 61, a former hospital administrator who had joined the Hale Dynamics board at Victoria's father's invitation 8 years ago, and who had, as Victoria now understood, been uncomfortable with the direction of the past year in ways she'd attributed to her own misreading of the situation, rather than to any concrete wrongdoing. She had the expression of someone who has discovered that their instincts were correct and wishes they hadn't been. "I should have pushed harder in April," Patricia said, "when the Q2 summaries didn't add up. I told myself it was the transition, that I was being unfair to Leonard." She paused. "I was being unfair to you." "You didn't have the information." "No, but I had a feeling, and I let Leonard's authority override it." She looked at her hands on the table. "Your father would have pushed. He never let a number go unexplained. My father trusted Leonard completely." Victoria said it without bitterness, but not without weight. "He didn't push either." Patricia was quiet for a moment. "What do you need from me today?" "The board meeting Leonard called for this morning. I need you to adjourn it. He won't be attending, but his people on the board may try to move without him. The agenda item is removing executive oversight from me. I need that motion to die before it's made. Consider it done." Patricia said it without hesitation, with the firmness of someone who has been waiting to be useful and is finally getting the chance. "I'll call Gerald before 10. He's an idiot, but he's not corrupt. When he understands what Leonard's been doing, he'll fall in line. Thank you." "Don't thank me. I owe you several months of not doing this sooner." She picked up her phone. "Go do whatever you need to do today. I'll handle the board." Victoria walked out of the building and into a cold Monday morning that had the gray, pressurized quality of a day that is about to matter, and stood on the sidewalk for a moment with her coat collar up and her breath visible in the November air, and allowed herself, for exactly 30 seconds, to feel the full weight of the past 3 months sitting on her chest. Then she exhaled and walked toward her car and called Ethan. He answered on the second ring. Marsh sent me the same text, he said. Are you home? Just got back from dropping Sophie at school. A pause. She wanted to know why I walked her to the door instead of the corner. I told her I felt like it. What did she say? She said, okay, but don't do it every day or people will talk. He said it with the specific tired affection of a father who has been given a window into who his daughter is becoming and isn't sure whether to laugh or feel something bigger. She's 7. She's 50, Victoria said. Yeah. A beat. How are you? It was a simple question, delivered simply, but it had weight coming from him because he didn't ask it casually. He asked it the way he did most things, because he actually wanted to know. I think I'm okay, she said honestly. Ask me again in about 6 hours. I will. What? Leonard Graves was arrested at the Hale Dynamics building at 11:22. Morning, 8 minutes after the warrant was executed at his home address, and the federal agents found him already at his desk, apparently operating on the assumption that Monday morning normalcy was still available to him. Later, people who witnessed it would describe the moment as anticlimactic, a man in a good suit putting down his coffee and standing up very slowly, like someone who had known this was coming and had decided the only dignity left was in not running. Victoria was not there for it. She was in Marsh's actual office, the real one, not the bookstore apartment, going through her formal witness statement with a DOJ attorney named Perkins, who had the energy of someone who had been awake since before the warrant and found this energizing rather than depleting. It took 4 hours. It was thorough and specific, and by the end of it, Victoria's voice was slightly rough, and her hand ached from signing documents, but the statement was complete and the record was established, and the version of events that Leonard had been slowly constructing. The overwhelmed CEO, the grief-compromised decisions, the leadership failure, had been systematically dismantled on the record and replaced with facts. Daniel Price was picked up at a gas station outside of Kennebunk at 2 in the afternoon, which Marsh relayed to her with the dry brevity of a man reporting weather. Price in custody. Kennebunk. Rental car. The rental car connected him to the vehicle on the highway, which connected him to the man with the assault charges, which was a thread that federal prosecutors would spend the next several months pulling. 2 of the officials connected to the Caraway payments resigned before the week was out. Not arrested, not yet, but visible enough that staying in place was no longer tenable. The Caraway firm itself would be the subject of a separate investigation that Marsh mentioned only once, briefly, in a way that suggested it was someone else's problem now. Kowalski gave a full deposition. His hands stopped shaking around the 3rd hour. It was, as these things go, not clean. Nothing involving 6 years of institutional fraud ever resolves cleanly. There are threads that don't get pulled, corners that don't get lit. People who knew and stayed quiet, who will never face anything worse than their own knowledge. Victoria understood this. She'd understood it before Marsh confirmed it, because she had grown up watching her father navigate the gap between what was right and what was provable, and she knew that the gap never fully closes. You close what you can, you document what you can, you make it harder for the next person who tries. What was clean? The evidence. What was documented? $6,400,000, 7 shell entities, 4 years, 1 corrupted man who had sat at her father's dinner table and laughed at his jokes, and built a structure designed to survive his death. The thing that stayed with her, in the weeks afterward, was not the fraud itself. It was the dinner tables, the ordinary evenings, the complete and functional performance of loyalty that Leonard had maintained for years while doing the opposite. She had spent a lot of time thinking about what that required of a person, and she had not arrived at an answer that made sense to her. And eventually she decided that some things don't make sense, and it costs you something to keep trying to find the shape of them. She thought about this one evening and mentioned it to Ethan, sitting on his porch in the cold, both of them with coffee. Sophie inside doing homework under protest. Some people compartmentalize so completely that the compartments stop communicating, he said. He was looking at the water in the distance, where the last light was going flat over the harbor. They don't experience contradiction because they've stopped letting the two halves of themselves into the same room. Is that a medical observation or a personal one? Both, probably. He turned his mug in his hands. I was angry at myself for a long time after Claire. I kept going over it, the differential, the treatment timeline, what I might have caught earlier. And the compartment that said you're a trauma surgeon, you save people kept slamming into the compartment that said you couldn't save her. And I couldn't make them stop talking to each other. He paused. I think that's actually healthier than what Leonard did. even though it felt worse, feeling the contradiction. Feeling it means you're still one person. He looked at her. Leonard stopped being one person a long time ago. She held her coffee cup and thought about this. The evening was cold and still, the harbor lights starting to come on across the water, and somewhere inside the house, Sophie was saying something to her stuffed rabbit with the animated authority of a child explaining a math problem she finds unreasonably complicated. "Do you still do it?" Victoria asked. "The compartments, the going over." "Less." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been doing the grief work, properly. There's a therapist in the city. I've been going for 6 weeks. He said it without self-consciousness, just information, though she could tell it cost him something to say. It was Mara who suggested it, actually, 2 years ago. I said I'd think about it." He paused. "Took me a while to think about it." "How is it?" "Hard." A beat. "Good." "Hard and good in approximately equal parts." He looked at his mug. Sophie noticed. She said, "I've been smiling more." Then she said, "It's weird, but I like it," which is exactly how she delivers every compliment. Victoria smiled. "She really does have your delivery." "She really does not," he said, and there was something in his voice when he said it, a warmth that wasn't performing itself, just existing, the way warmth exists in a room that's been heated for a while without your noticing the transition. "She has Claire's." Then Claire had very good delivery. He looked at her. In the fading light, his face was open in a way it had taken months to become, the careful architecture of his reserve not gone, but renovated. The walls still there, but the windows put in, so that the inside was visible if you knew where to look. "She would have said the same thing about you," he said quietly. She had a talent for finding the specific true thing to say about a person. It was the second time he'd offered Claire to her like that, not as a boundary or a comparison, but as a bridge. Victoria understood what it meant because she'd watched him come to it slowly, over weeks and months, the way a person comes to trust that the ground will hold before they step all the way onto it. "I wish I'd known her," Victoria said. "Yeah." He was quiet for a long moment. "Me too, but He stopped, tried again. "I'm grateful for what's here, whatever this is." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not very good at saying that kind of thing." "You just said it." "Barely." "It counts," she said. "Ita." The restructuring of Hale Dynamics took 4 months, which was faster than anyone expected and slower than Victoria wanted. She worked 18-hour days for most of November and all of December, which she was aware was not sustainable and did anyway, because some things require a concentrated burn before they can stabilize. Donna managed the calendar and the board communications and the external PR with the efficiency of someone who had been operating above her title for years and had simply stopped pretending otherwise. Patricia Howe stepped into the interim board chair position with a competence that made Victoria wonder, not for the first time, what the company might have looked like if Leonard had never been there at all. The company Victoria remade was not identical to the one her father had built, because she was not identical to her father, and she'd spent enough time in her own head to know that trying to replicate his vision exactly would be both impossible and wrong. What she took from him was the framework, the conviction that healthcare systems should serve the people inside them, rather than the other way around. And what she added was her own, which was less patience for the distance between stated values and actual practice. She redirected a significant portion of the company's services toward regional hospital systems that were understaffed and undersupported, with particular focus on rural communities that had been losing access to emergency care for a decade. This was not, as Gerald Fitch helpfully pointed out in a board meeting, the most profitable direction. Victoria told him that was fine and moved to the next agenda item. It was at one of these planning meetings, in February, that Mara Chen, who had been brought in as a consultant for the Maine Med Partnership, mentioned that the Rural Emergency Medicine Initiative had finally found a physician director. "Dr. Cole starts in March," Mara said, with the specific tone of someone delivering information they are mildly pleased about. "Part-time, 3 days a week, covering the Washington County corridor." He was very specific about the part-time. "I know," Victoria said. Mara looked at her. "Of course you do." Patricia, sitting at the other end of the table, said nothing and looked at her notes with a smile she was not bothering to suppress. Victoria moved to the next agenda item. The license reinstatement had taken 6 weeks of paperwork and 1 interview with the Maine Medical Board that Ethan described afterward as the most aggressively polite conversation I've ever had, which was saying something given that he'd spent 3 years doing paperwork for the Army. He'd sat at his kitchen table the evening after the interview with the forms spread out in front of him, and a cup of bad coffee going cold, and Sophie had come in from her room, assessed the situation, and sat down across from him with her rabbit. "Did it go okay?" she asked. "I think so." "Are you nervous?" "About what part?" She considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "About going back to being a doctor." He looked at his daughter. At 7, almost 8 now, the birthday coming in April, she had the face she'd been growing into since she was born, and it was Claire's around the eyes and his around the jaw, and entirely her own everywhere else. She held things carefully and put them down deliberately, and noticed more than anyone gave her credit for, and Ethan had long since stopped being surprised by this, and started simply being grateful for it. "A little," he said honestly, "but you're going to do it anyway." "Yeah." She nodded slowly, the way she nodded when something confirmed a thing she'd already decided was true. "Talk didn't stop being a watchdog just because he was sad," she said. "He just needed someone to remind him what he was for." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. "You're going to reference that book at me forever, aren't you?" "Probably," she said, which was his word exactly, in his tone exactly, delivered with the complete serenity of a person who knows they've won an argument without having to make it into one. He reached across the table and tugged gently on the ear of her rabbit, which was the closest he could get to expressing what he was feeling without it becoming a whole thing, and she leaned forward and put her forehead briefly against his hand, which was what she did when she understood. March came in with the particular optimism of a Maine March. Cold still, the water still gray, but the light changing, more of it each day, arriving earlier and staying later with the quiet insistence of something that has decided its time. Victoria started running in the mornings again, something she'd dropped in October when the company crisis had consumed everything else, and she felt the rustiness of it for the first 2 weeks before her body remembered what it was doing. She ran along the harbor path, past the early morning fishermen and the dog walkers, and the occasional other runner who acknowledged her with the brief, mutual nod of people who share a slightly absurd commitment to being outside before 6. The city in early March had a stripped-down quality she'd always liked. The tourists not yet arrived, the summer infrastructure still dormant, Portland as its own self rather than the version it performed for visitors. She thought sometimes about the morning in October when she'd left Brennan's cafe without her bag, walking fast down Maple Street with her phone still warm from the call with Marcus, and her hands trembling just slightly. She thought about what the day would have looked like if she'd gone back to the table immediately and found the clutch sitting there untouched. She would have picked it up, driven to the office, spent another day managing a situation she didn't yet understand in a way that wasn't working. She would never have tracked down the registration, would never have gone to Birchwood Lane, would never have sat in that kitchen with the chipped rim mug and the grocery list in masking tape and the small girl reading a book with the focused intensity of someone who had decided books were where the important things lived. She thought about this fact that Ethan had spent maybe 15 seconds deciding whether to pick up the clutch and return it. Not a dramatic decision, not a conscious act of virtue. Just a man who, when he saw something that wasn't right, fixed it because it was the kind of person he was. Built from years of doing the hard thing in places where the hard thing required everything. She thought about how many things depend on 15-second decisions made by people who don't know what they're setting in motion. This was, she had come to believe, one of the truest things about how lives actually work. Not the big moments, not the grand gestures, but the accumulation of small acts performed without audience, the choices made in the ordinary seconds between one thing and the next. Her father had tried to tell her something like this once, in a way she hadn't been ready to hear, and she thought she finally understood it now, not as a lesson, but as something she'd lived her way into. She ran past the harbor and the boats and the early light on the water, and by the time she got back to her building, her face was cold and her lungs were clear, and she felt, in the uncomplicated way of a body that has been used properly, like herself. In April, Sophie turned 8. The birthday party was held in the backyard of the Birchwood Lane house on a Saturday that couldn't decide between sunshine and cloud, and eventually settled on both simultaneously, which produced a light that made everything look slightly gilded and slightly uncertain at the same time. There were 6 children from Sophie's class, 2 from the library reading group, and 1 from the Wednesday clinic. The teenager Ethan had treated in October, whose name was Marcus, and who was 16 and had apparently been coming to the free clinic regularly enough that he and Sophie had, in the inexplicable way of an age gap that should have precluded friendship, developed a rapport based on shared opinions about books. James had driven down from Bangor. Ruth from next door brought a cake she'd baked herself that was, in Ruth's words, imperfect but sincere. which was exactly accurate and also somehow the best cake at the table. Mara Chen came for an hour and ate potato chips in the kitchen with Donna and managed to be simultaneously charming and evaluating, which was something Victoria had come to recognize as Mara's natural state. Ethan ran the backyard with the organized calm of a man who understood logistical challenges, which a birthday party for 8 children essentially is, and Victoria helped in the ways she was asked and stayed out of the way in the ways she wasn't, and the afternoon went the way good afternoons go. Imperfectly, noisily, with several minor crises that resolved themselves and one cake-cutting incident that produced more laughing than crying, which is the correct ratio. At some point in the late afternoon, when the children had migrated toward the back fence and James was talking to Ruth about her garden, and Donna was telling Mara something that was making Mara laugh, Victoria found herself standing at the edge of the porch with a cup of coffee watching the yard, and Ethan came to stand beside her. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment. 8, he said, watching Sophie instruct 2 of her friends in the correct way to hold a book open without cracking the spine, which was apparently urgent information. She's 8. She's approximately 35, Victoria said. She keeps telling me she's ready for a fish. Are you ready for a fish? I'm terrified of a fish. I will be destroyed when the fish dies, and I'll have to pretend I'm not for her sake. He paused. I'm getting her the fish. Victoria looked at him. He was watching his daughter with the expression she'd come to know as his version of pure feeling. Contained, present, not performing itself, just there. He'd been wearing it more often in the past few months, and each time she saw it, she felt the same thing she'd felt in the yard in Bangor in November. The quiet, irreversible knowledge that she was already in this, had been for a while, and that trying to organize it into something manageable was a project she'd quietly abandoned without announcing it. I want to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. When Claire died, I made a decision that I wasn't going to... He stopped. Tried again, because with important things he didn't let himself stop. She'd noticed that about him. I decided that I'd done the one important thing, which was that I had Sophie, and everything else I was going to hold at a distance. People, work, the whole... I was going to stay inside the perimeter I'd drawn and take care of my daughter and not want anything that I might lose. The afternoon light was going soft around the edges, the undecided sky having finally settled into something that looked like gold. That's a reasonable thing to decide, Victoria said carefully. It was a frightened thing to decide, he said. It felt like reason. It wasn't, he paused. The therapist and I have been spending a lot of time on the difference. She waited. What I'm trying to say... He turned to look at her directly, with the same unsheltered directness he'd used in the kitchen that first October afternoon, when she'd said, I don't have anyone I can think out loud with, and he'd looked at her for a long moment before he'd said anything. I'm not good at this part, the saying it. You've said it already. Not the specific, Ethan. She kept her voice even, but her chest was doing something she'd stopped trying to control 2 months ago. I live 4 miles away. I have been to your house 17 times since October. Sophie calls me on Wednesdays when you're at the clinic. Your father sends me recipes. She paused. I think we've already covered the specific thing, you just haven't said it out loud. He looked at her for a moment. Something in his face did what it occasionally did, the controlled surface giving way briefly to whatever was under it, which was more and clearer and less defended than anything you saw when he was being careful. I don't want to lose this, he said. Simple. No architecture around it. You're not going to lose this. You don't know that. No, she said, but I'm choosing to believe it until I have evidence otherwise. He recognized his own words. She saw him recognize them. Something moved through his expression, not quite a smile, but the cousin of one, warm and unguarded and real. He reached over and took her hand, not dramatically, not with announcement, just picked it up the way you pick up something you've been meaning to pick up for a while, and held it with the same care he brought to everything he did. Steady, present, not performing. She held it back. In the yard, Sophie looked up from her book spine tutorial and saw them on the porch. She looked at their hands. Then she looked at her father's face, which was the face of a person who has put down something heavy, and she evaluated this information with her usual devastating efficiency. Then she went back to explaining the book spine thing to her friends, because she had decided this was fine and there was work to be done. She's not surprised, Victoria said. Sophie has not been surprised by anything since approximately age 5, Ethan said. I think she knew before I did. She definitely knew before you did. He squeezed her hand once, lightly. Yeah, he said. Probably. What? Summer arrived on the Maine coast the way it always does. Gradually, and then all at once, the gray April giving way to a May that couldn't quite commit, and then June arriving with warmth that felt like something had finally been decided. The harbor filled with boats. The tourists returned. Portland put its better face on for the season. The Hale Dynamics restructuring was formally complete by the end of May, ratified by a board vote that wasn't unanimous. Gerald Fitch abstained, which was the closest he could get to objecting without actually objecting, but decisive. The new company charter included explicit commitments to the Rural Healthcare Initiative, to the Community Clinic Partnership, and to a transparency framework for financial reporting that made what Leonard had done structurally harder for anyone to replicate. It was not a perfect document. It was a better one. Leonard Graves entered a guilty plea in June Federal Court, Portland. The sentence would come later. His attorney was arguing for consideration based on his age and his prior clean record, which was the kind of argument that works sometimes and doesn't others. Victoria was not in the courtroom. Marsh had told her she didn't need to be, and she'd believed him, and had spent that morning instead at a community meeting in Washington County, where Ethan's rural emergency program was presenting its first quarter outcomes to a room full of people who had been driving 45 minutes to the nearest emergency room for years. She watched him present the data. Clear, direct, no performance in it, just the facts of what they'd done and what it had meant and what they still needed. And she thought about the afternoon on Birchwood Lane when she'd told him he was still a doctor, and she thought about how long it takes a person to believe something true about themselves that they've been arguing against. I was good at it, not smooth. He stumbled once over a statistic and circled back to correct it with the slightly pained expression of someone who dislikes imprecision in themselves. He answered questions from the floor with patience and specificity. When an elderly woman asked him directly whether the program would still be there in 5 years, he said, "I intend to make sure it is," and said it in a way that made her nod slowly, satisfied, in the manner of someone who is good at reading people and has gotten the read they were looking for. Afterward, driving back down the coast, Sophie in the back seat with a library book and an opinion about everything, Ethan said, "Gerald Fitch sent the company a check." Victoria turned to look at him. For what? Anonymous donation. Except it wasn't especially anonymous. His assistant sent it on his company letterhead. He kept his eyes on the road, but there was something dry and warm in his voice. For the clinic partnership, significant amount. Gerald Fitch donated to the clinic. Gerald Fitch donated to the clinic. Victoria looked out the window at the coast road, where the ocean was doing what the main ocean does in June, blue and cold, and completely indifferent to everything that had happened in the past 8 months, which she found, in a complicated way, reassuring. The world had not reorganized itself around the drama. It had continued, as it does. The harbor was the harbor. The boats were the boats. The light on the water was the same light it had always been. "People surprise you," she said. "When you give them the chance," he said. "Is that philosophy or experience?" "In my experience, they're the same thing." "Dad," Sophie said from the back seat without looking up from her book, "are we stopping for food or not? I've been patient." "You've been patient for approximately 11 minutes, Ethan said. "That's a long time." "It's not a long time." "It feels long. Most important things feel long when you're in the middle of them," he said. "That's how you know they matter." Sophie considered this. "Is that also philosophy or experience?" "Both." "Okay." She went back to her book. "Can we still stop for food, though?" They stopped for lobster rolls at a place on the water that had plastic chairs and paper plates, and a line that moved slowly and was worth it. They ate at a picnic table facing the harbor, Sophie with a streak of butter on her chin that she was unaware of, Ethan with his elbows on the table and his face in the sun, in the uncomplicated way of someone who has made a decision to be where they are instead of somewhere else. Victoria looked at the two of them, the man who had spent 3 years making himself small to survive, and the girl who had grown up in the space created by that smallness, and somehow never been diminished by it. And she thought about what Ethan's father had said in the driveway in November. "I know what he looks like when he stopped running from something." She thought about what it had cost him to stop. The years of running, the license on the shelf, the evenings at the kitchen table with the bills arranged in order of urgency as a way of feeling in control of something uncontrollable. The way he'd held Sophie in the yard in November with his face pressed against the top of her head, like a man relearning that the thing he was most afraid to lose was still there. She thought about her own version of running, which had been less visible but just as real. The apartment full of work and no people. The company as a substitute for a life. The very careful management of anything that might require her to want something she couldn't guarantee. She thought about a cold October morning and a leather clutch on a cafe table, and the specific unexamined calculation she'd made when she decided to go to Birchwood Lane, which was not about gratitude and never really had been. She had been looking for someone to trust. That was what she'd been looking for, underneath all the reasonable explanations she'd given herself. After months of watching every person around her calculate and position and protect themselves at someone else's expense, she had looked at a man in a worn flannel jacket who had picked up something that didn't belong to him and handed it back without wanting anything for it, and she had thought, that is what I've been missing. She had not known then that what she was missing was bigger than that. Now she did. Sophie looked up from the last of her lobster roll and looked at Victoria with those clear, disconcerting brown eyes. "Are you moving in?" she asked. Ethan made a sound. "Sophie, it's a reasonable question. She's here all the time and she knows where everything is, and she fixed the kitchen drawer that's been broken for 8 months. She paused. "I'm not opposed to it. I'm just asking." The harbor lay in front of them, bright and blue, the kind of June afternoon that Maine holds out as evidence of itself. Somewhere across the water a boat was coming in, slow and steady, and the light came off the water in that particular way that makes ordinary things look briefly significant. Victoria looked at Ethan. I was looking at her with that open, renovated look she'd come to know. The windows in the walls, the inside visible. And there was something in it that was question and answer at the same time. "Ask me again in a few minutes," Victoria told Sophie. "We're still figuring it out." "Okay," Sophie said, satisfied with this, as she was satisfied with any direct, honest answer. She picked up her book. "But I'm getting a fish next week, so there will be more to take care of." "We haven't decided on the fish yet," Ethan said. "I've decided," Sophie said. "You're still catching up." She returned to her book. Ethan looked at Victoria with the expression of a man who has been defeated by a 7-year-old and is not entirely unhappy about it. Victoria pressed her lips together and looked at the water so she didn't laugh in a way that would encourage Sophie further. Under the table, his hand found hers again. As simple as the first time. As easy as something that has found the place it belongs. The boat came into the harbor. The light moved across the water the way light always moves, without caring, without meaning to, just moving, which is its own kind of constancy. Sophie read her book. The butter streak was still on her chin. The afternoon held. None of them had been looking for this. That was perhaps the most honest thing that could be said about it. Not the part where it was good. It was good, sometimes complicated and incomplete, and asking things of all three of them that they were still learning how to give. But the part where none of them had set out to find it. No plan, no search, no design. Just a cold morning and a forgotten bag and a man who stopped. Everything else came from that. The real things usually do. Somewhere across the city, in the archives of a federal courthouse, a set of documents sat in a sealed evidence box. Printed transaction logs, annotated in red ink, 7 incorporation certificates from Delaware, a USB drive encrypted with a password that spelled something backwards. The box would sit there for years, referenced occasionally, not often. On Maple Street, Brennan's Cafe opened at 6 every morning. The corner booth by the window was, most days, occupied. And on Birchwood Lane, a small fish tank arrived on a Tuesday in a cardboard box. Sophie named the fish immediately. She had clearly been deciding on the name for some time. She named him Talk.